The story begins in a garden from where a voice can be heard admiring the surrounding beauty. The princess of the Firenze Empire, Ashtart Firenze, didn't even think that such a big garden existed, and it was so cool that she didn't notice how time flew by. At that moment, a girl named Lowina came up. She asked the girl if she liked it here, to which Ashtart thanked her for bringing her here. Lowina smiled and said that she would ask Sir Ashen to let her come here again. The girl suddenly asked if she was sure that everything was fine, and she didn't want to get into trouble. At this moment, the Imperial palace maid leaned over and addressed Her Highness and said that she had absolutely nothing to worry about. The girl, of course, understood that this garden was not for Princess Ashtart, because this special garden, where thanks to the magic of the prince lilies bloom all year round, belongs to the Princess of Light. This means that they cannot harm the garden because it is under the influence of magic. There is nothing wrong with visiting here. Sometimes Ashtart admired the effect of magic, and yet she began to speak admiringly about how she would also like to be able to cast spells. Lowina asked in surprise why she needed it. The princess replied that if she could use magic, she would revive the vegetation outside the palace. And what's more, she would make sure that there was no dirt in the palace, that it was always clean. And in that case, her maid could rest more because she would not have to clean so hard. Lowina at that moment even felt a little touched because she was too kind. Lowina even laughed, saying that in that case she wouldn't have to secretly help her with the cleaning. Ashtart said that it wasn't difficult for her, but the maid replied that she felt awkward. And yet, Lowina really didn't understand why a princess who worries even about a humble maid could be the darkness that would bring misfortune. 158 Florence Empire. This is the time when the darkest moon is replaced by a red sun. During this period, new stars of light and darkness will be born in the empire. Light, like a miracle, will bring prosperity to the empire. Well, the darkness, of course, will in turn swallow up the light and lead the empire to destruction. One day, as the high priest had predicted, 2 princesses were born on the day of the dark moon. One was an illegitimate child of a commoner girl, but because she had the silver hair characteristic of the imperial family, she was revered as a princess of light. But Princess Ashtart, with pure imperial blood, was born with black hair which had never been seen before in the empire, and therefore she was called darkness or disaster. Unfortunately, soon after, it so happened that the Empress died shortly after giving birth to Ashtart. This incident further convinced people that Princess Ashtart was the cursed child of the prophecy, and some even blamed her for the death of the Empress. And yet few were sure that it was not Ashtart's fault. In any case, from the moment Lowina first saw the princess, she couldn't believe that this girl was considered darkness. This girl was too sweet. She was always helping her with cleaning, constantly thanking her for food, and was happy to do something good. Lowina held back her anger at the whole world because she knew that this pathetic prophecy was ruining the life of a small and innocent girl who did not understand what was happening. Ashtart was a little scared at this point because she saw Lowina clenching her fists. She clenched them like that when the funding for the Empress's palace was cut off. And yet, even through her anger and hurt, Lowina asked the princess if she wanted to eat. Ashtart, a little scared, replied that she was fine and wanted to walk a little more. Lowina in turn said that if she skipped meals she would get sick. The girl immediately said that she rarely managed to leave the palace. With a heavy sigh, she decided to let her take a walk, and the best person to help with this would be Sir Ashen, the captain of the Imperial Guard unit. He had just asked her to bring food to the princess. Lowina asked in surprise why he would stay for a walk with the princess, to which he replied that he knew the garden better than her. Anyway, the girl resigned herself, asking him to look after the princess. Soon Ashen and the princess went for a walk, and Lowina went back. At that moment, as soon as the captain of the guard took the girl by the hand, he felt how rude they were. He knew she was doing servant work at such a young age, and that her hands should not be like that. Anyway, the girl looked at him and asked if he often came here. The guy said he had only been there a few times, and he had studied the layout of the garden carefully to know where everything was. Ashtart smiled and said it was amazing. Soon the boys were walking and enjoying the view around them, when suddenly a voice was heard asking Ashen in surprise what he was doing there. The guy immediately realized whose voice it was, and as soon as he turned his head, he only became convinced of his thoughts. The crown prince of the Firenze Empire, Miragein. Firenze slammed the book shut as soon as he saw Ashtart. Ashen said that the princess wanted to see the garden, so he was accompanying her. Ashtart suddenly began to curtsy, which she definitely did not need to do. However, this is a family member she has not been able to see for some time now. This is her half-brother in whom her blood flows. One night a girl found him unconscious and tried to help him. Once he came to, the girl asked if he was really her brother, to which Miragein told her not to call him that. The guy left, telling her to address him as the Crown Prince like everyone else did, because only one person can call him brother, and that is his sister Riley. Our heroine held back her tears just thinking about this incident, but at the same time she wondered, wasn't she his sister? How was she worse than Amaryllis? Just at that moment, the girl put the tea on the table and said that she was very honored to hear that Ashtart liked this garden. Imperial Princess Amaryllis, also known as Riley, asked Ashtart if she would like to have tea with them. Within moments, they were all sitting at the table. Riley was pouring tea and saying that she had heard about it from rumors, but she had always been interested in seeing it in real life. Our heroine asked in surprise what she was talking about, to which Amaryllis replied that she was talking about her jet black hair. Ashtart sighed and said that it was the first time she saw her silver hair too. Hair reminiscent of white lilies, eyes like chrysolites. This is simply a model of grace and elegance. This is what everyone's favorite Amaryllis looks like. Just at that moment, Princess Riley suddenly said that all the people were telling her to stay away from her. Our heroine at that moment was thinking about how nice and beautiful she was, but what the princess said instantly knocked out all the thoughts that were in her head. Ashtart looked down in disappointment, realizing that this was why her family refused to see her, because she was darkness. At this point, Riley looked at Ashtart's hair and said that she had never seen a hair clip like that before. She asked if it was hers. Our heroine smiled happily and said that Lowina, her maid, had given it to her. Riley looked slyly at her sister and said that it was quite cute, but nevertheless the hairpin was rather worn. Princess Amaryllis held out her hand and said only one thing she wanted. She told him to give this hairpin to her. Our heroine was simply at a loss at this moment and didn't even know what to answer. Anyway, Riley stood up from her chair in confusion and slapped the table, asking what had happened. If anyone had heard Ashtart now, they would have thought she was trying to take it away. However, she repeated over and over again that it was just a small and cheap hair clip, so there was nothing wrong with lending it to her. Then Amaryllis looked at her sister in surprise and asked if she really hated her that much. Watching what was happening, Sir Ashen was shocked because he knew about this hairpin of Princess Ashtart. Returning back, he remembers how the girl walking with him through the garden asked in surprise if there were lilies of the valley here. Ashen asked again in surprise and said that they most likely weren't there. But the question was, does she really like these flowers? The girl nodded her head and said that according to rumors, Lily of the Valley means becoming happy no matter what. That's what Lowina told her when she gave her a Lily of the Valley hair clip for her birthday, and that's why she really likes these flowers. The captain of the guard smiled and said that Lowina was very wise, and yet the pin was worn and the princess never went anywhere without it. Ashen couldn't even imagine how dear this gift was to the princess. That's why, looking at her sister, the girl said that she would not give it to her. She apologized sincerely but decided to point out that it was her thing and she couldn't lend it. In the blink of an eye, Riley changed her demeanor, asking how Ashtart dared to tell her no. At that very second, she knocked down all the cutlery that was on the table and all the cups flew in different directions. Amaryllis immediately attacked the princess and began to manually try to take the hairpin. However, Miragein grabbed his sister's hand and said that he had had enough. Almost immediately, the girl pulled her hand away and stepped aside, starting to cry. The crown prince was not feeling very well, so he went to his sister and said that if she wanted this thing, he would simply find the same one. Amaryllis turned around in disbelief and told her brother that this was mean. Was he really acting like she was taking away this hairpin? Was she really that kind of person? And yet the girl was very angry because her brother had never spoken out against her before. Meanwhile, Sir Ashen ran up to the princess and asked if she was in pain, to which the girl replied that she was fine. Miragein's voice was heard from behind, guiltily saying that he had not meant it, and still another cup flew to the ground. Amaryllis cried and screamed. She asked why they were doing this and what other people would think of her. Miragein asked his sister to calm down, but the girl jumped up and sharply told him that she hated him and everyone else, so she was leaving. The crown prince sighed heavily and turned to Ashen and told him to follow the princess. The boy could not refuse, so he bowed and followed. Thus, two people remained at the table, Ashtart and also the crown prince, who decided to enjoy the remains of the tea party. Our heroine at that moment understood that she needed to go back, and Miragein looked at her and asked, "Is this really a new dress?" He explained that it was different from the one she had on the last time they met. The girl was surprised but said that it was new, and yet, did he really notice? The guy asked her if she liked it too, which the girl said that she liked it and it was very beautiful. Miragein was happy, and it looked much better than the old and shabby dress. He didn't understand why it took her so long to buy a new dress. She was a princess. The maid probably didn't manage the finances well. However, at that very moment, he wanted to say that he was happy for her, and Ashtart added that Lowina had made this dress for her. The guy asked again, perplexed. A moment later, he was incredibly angry, asking if the maid had really made a dress for her, the princess. The girl was scared at that moment because she knew what anger looked like. She asked her brother in a calm voice what happened. Only in response, she heard Miragein remind her not to call him brother. Moreover, he said that she should be more careful from now on, because today he stopped really, but he will not do it again. And yet our heroine did not understand this injustice and began to say that she was the same sister to him as really. She didn't understand why she couldn't receive love and attention, even just a little bit. Miragein suddenly said that if he had to choose between the two, he would choose really without hesitation. At that moment, the girl involuntarily began to cry because she did not understand why he was so cruel to her. The guy slammed the table hard and asked the girl if she really wanted to make him feel guilty with her pitiful look. The crown prince was about to leave, and finally asked her if she really wanted him to pretend to be good out of compassion for her. Soon he told her to stop doing this as it was pointless and began to move away from the garden. But our heroine was thinking about how she dreamed of a walk with her father and brother in the garden, although Amaryllis could have walked like that every day. The girl wanted to be loved one day, but it was all just her pathetic dreams because life is unfair. In any case, she pushed back her chair and began to rise, realizing that it was time for her to return home. Suddenly, the girl noticed a book right in front of her. Looking at it closer, she assumed that it was a book of magic. There are not many people in the Empire who use magic, but the princes are usually skilled in magic, especially Miragein, who is considered a genius of the generation. The girl opened the book and began to try to make out something, but this book was full of letters that she had never seen before. It immediately became clear that to use magic, you need to know many languages. Not everyone is able to learn them, so magic is considered a symbol of power and greatness of the Empire. The girl continued to run her eyes over the book, realizing that she had never seen this language before, but judging from the pictures, she assumed that she had stumbled upon disappearance magic. To her surprise, she still realized that she could read it, which made her realize that she could read magic. She immediately began to turn the pages, realizing that she wanted to read everything. On many pages, there were notes that apparently belonged to Miragein, which meant that the brother noted the topics that he understood. Those that he found confusing were also marked as were topics with which he had problems. Ashtart suddenly thought, if she could help her brother, would he take care of her a little better? The girl immediately decided for herself that this could be her key to a happy future. Soon she came across some interesting magic that determined destiny. The girl cast a spell, Disimsonia. At that very moment, the world around her became distorted and took on negative colors. At the same moment, the action takes us to another place. Presumably, it was someone's office. Ashtart slowly began to open her eyes, and fortunately, everything was fine with her. There was one problem less, but still the main question was, now where was she? After all, this was an unfamiliar room for her. Ashtart began to analyze what had happened and realized that she had heard a strange sound and suddenly found herself here. Could it be because she had read out loud? At that moment, the girl looked around the room and, to her horror, noticed that there was someone else there. She immediately screamed and asked in confusion who was there. Instantly, the sound of chains was heard spreading throughout the room, followed by a voice saying that it was too late for guests. Could it be an intruder? Our heroine was shocked as soon as she saw all these chains. This man lives here, but he is in shackles. Is he really a criminal? Anyway, the guy showed his face and said that he would give her a chance. If she left here right now, he would not destroy her. The girl immediately grabbed the book and began to pronounce the same spell, but now for some reason it did not work, although she pronounced it correctly. The guy standing behind turned to the stranger in surprise and asked what kind of magic it was. Ashtart said in a confused voice that the book said that this spell would help you find your destiny and purpose. At that moment, the guy smiled because what the girl said was quite funny. Looking at her, he asked if they had already come up with a new type of pickup line. Ashtart was shocked. She immediately began to nervously say that she had not tried to do anything like that and that he had misunderstood her because this was ordinary magic. The mysterious young man named Aelion sighed heavily and said that he was even a little sorry. Our heroine was incredibly angry with him because he seems to be the type of person who likes to joke. And yet she looked at him, realizing that initially he had seemed more frightening to her. After all, his first words were that if she left here right now, he would spare her. Now he looked at the girl's hairpin in surprise and asked if it was really lilies of the valley. Ashtart nodded, and he said that it suited her very well. She continued to look at him closely, suggesting that he was not as bad as he seemed. Aelion laughed in surprise and asked what she was looking at. Was there something on his face? Ashtart started to say that everything was fine, and in that case, the guy asked her to stop looking at him so suspiciously. Coming closer to her, he said that she would do better to tell him her name, and what's more, she said that he was her destiny. There is a legend about an ancient goddess named Ashtarte. She is the goddess of war and love. At least that's what this guy Rion, a handsome and mysterious young man with purple eyes, told her. By the way, several days have passed since she arrived here. Ryan allowed our heroine to stay with him until she found a way to return home. The funny thing was that as soon as she saw the shackles on him, she thought he was a criminal. Luckily, she was wrong, because what kind of criminal would have so much delicious food? Ashtart was licking her lips at that moment, looking at the plate, and the guy was laughing and asking her not to take on her own, because it was all for her. She shouldn't worry and just eat. The girl smiled happily and thanked him for the sandwich. Ashtart decided that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover after all. At the same time, Aelion thought the same thing because the girl looked like a noble lady, but something was wrong here. Our heroine was eating at the time and she was interested in one question: who cooks all this delicious food? The guy remembered how a few days ago the girl was afraid to eat because she said that she could last almost a week on water alone. She called it her talent. He certainly said it was not something to brag about, but at the moment he did not understand what it was or why. In any case, he knew that this would bother him for the near future. Nevertheless, Ashtart approached him. The girl asked him if he had really been here alone all this time. How was he coping? The guy thought for a moment and said that he was not actually alone. Ashtarte then assumed that he lived with his family. But this topic was certainly not one that Aelion wanted to talk about because there were reasons for that. The guy smiled slyly and told the girl in response to her question that this was not entirely true. Anyway, he asked Ashtarte a counter-question. He asked if she had a family. At that moment, our heroine only sighed heavily because she herself did not know the answer to this question. She never saw her father as a child, and when it comes to family, she certainly doesn't think of her brother or father. The first person who comes to her mind is Lowina, who has always been by her side, and she hoped that she would be able to see her soon. In any case, the action takes us to the evening. Ashtart at this point began to joyfully call Ryan and run to him. The girl ran with a book in her hands and asked him to look at it because it said that this spell could teleport him anywhere. The guy, of course, said it was cool, but he was wondering why she was showing it to him. The girl looked down in embarrassment and said that she wanted to share something interesting. Ryan, for some reason, also became sad and only told the girl to go and read on. It was quite curious because he already knew that this girl named after an ancient goddess with jet black hair which he had never seen before. He was surprised that she was quite talented in magic, and Ashtart had already cast over 500 spells in the few days she had spent here. Just at that moment, the girl cast another spell. Agriat instantly streams of wind began to spread around her. Rion was very surprised because he immediately realized that it was wind magic, which was pretty good. But as soon as the airflow passed, to his horror, he noticed an unpleasant picture, because at that moment, a book was about to fall on the girl. Aelion instantly ran up to the girl and covered her with himself, telling her that she needed to be careful. Soon the danger passed. The girl seemed not to be hurt, but the guy decided to make sure of it. Ashtart in turn said that it was not so important, and asked how he felt at the same time she shook him. Ryan said that he was fine and asked to stop shaking him. The girl still asked for forgiveness, saying that she was sorry because if she had been more careful, this would not have happened. At that very moment, Ryan mentally went back to the past, when he was sitting in the room blaming himself, saying that he should have been more careful. However, he turned to Ashtart and asked her not to apologize because he understands that she did not do it on purpose. Looking at her, he asked why she apologized so much when no one was even hurt. She constantly blamed herself for something, but she needed to be more respectful to herself. Ashtart suddenly wondered what this strange, familiar feeling was. She immediately realized that it was the same feeling when someone is worried about you. Quite nice. For example, Lowina took care of her. She told the princess that her hands were all scratched, that she needed to take better care of her health. The maid was puzzled that she always treated herself so disdainfully, and anyway she knew that Lowina was not angry but wanted to cry when she said all this. Ashtart realized that the maid sometimes scolded her like that too, and yet the girl looked at Ryan and asked if he was really worried about her. The guy asked again in surprise, and our heroine replied that someone had told her the same thing that he was now saying. It's just that whenever she gets scolded, she feels like they're really worried about her. However, at that moment, the guy remained silent and soon began to get up and apologize. He explained that when he looked at her, he remembered someone he used to know. Ashtart was surprised that she looked like someone he knew. Ryan at that moment turned to the girl again. He asked her in surprise if it was time for her to stop using magic, and no doubt these words surprised the girl. The guy reminded her that this was already about his 50th attempt. Ashtart really realized this. She promised Ryan that she would use magic a maximum of 5 to 10 times a day. The action takes us back 3 days. The girl was talking about how sorry she was. Aelion at that moment asked in confusion what she was talking about, and the girl replied that she did not know how to return. She soon decided that she shouldn't have opened the book because it was stupid to hope that she could help her brother. At that moment, the guy clapped his hands and asked her not to think anymore in the middle of a conversation because it was not good. He offered her an alternative, namely to try other spells. The book should definitely describe other magic related to movement. The girl hugged the book to herself and said that of course she didn't know if she would succeed, but she would definitely try. After some time, the guy told her that they had found out 4 things. First, she could use magic, and it was not an accident. The second thing he realized was that there must be a spell in the book that would help her get home. The third thing she needs is mana to use magic, but she currently has very little of it. And the fourth is that she can read any ancient language. Ashtart asked again in surprise at that moment. Ryan was surprised that the girl did not know about it. By the way, the language of magic comes from ancient languages, and there are 3 ancient languages, Rotsek, Sensiberian, and Wayrock. Knowing even one language is enough to be considered a genius. If you understand 2 languages, then you are a hero, but knowing all 3 is considered a blessing. And yet it is also regarded as a power that can destroy everything. Ryan thought that the girl never realized her own giftedness. And still, in his opinion, the girl was considered a dangerous child, but she was too naive. He was interested in what awaited her in the future. The guy suddenly said that it was like she was using magic for the first time, so he asked her to let him give her some advice. And by the way, it was necessary to keep it a secret from others. Ashtart was surprised that she couldn't even tell Miragein about this, so she asked why the conditions were like that. Aelion answered her question saying that it would be best for her own safety. He explained that great power can make people envious of it or even fear it. However, the action returns to real time. Ashtart told Ryan that she felt fine, so she asked to try again. Only Aelion replied that she couldn't do that. In any case, he decided to put the book in a safe place. He placed her on the very top and said that she would do well to rest and restore her mana. Ashtart wondered at this point, if she cast the spells only 5 or 10 times a day, would she be able to return home? Soon the action moves to the evening. Suddenly a ladder leans against the shelf. Obviously, the reason for this was a girl who decided to secretly get the book. The girl had almost reached the book, but she still lacked a little distance. Eventually, she slipped off the step and fell down with a loud scream. After some time, there were medicines on the tray, and Ryan said that the girl was lucky that she was not seriously injured. While he was treating the wounds, the girl told him that she was fine and could do everything herself. However, the boy continued to help the girl and suddenly apologized, assuming that the chains were scaring her. Ashtart replied that she was scared when she first saw them, but she was no longer afraid of them. These words definitely surprised Aelion. The girl looked into his eyes and said that he was kind, so she was not afraid of him, and she only twitched now because the chains were cold. The guy soon smiled involuntarily. In any case, in a few moments everything was over, and he finished helping her. However, at that moment, Ryan told the girl that she had said Lowina while falling. Ashtart asked in confusion if he had really heard that. The guy laughed and said that he heard it and that it was a bit weird. In turn, Ashtart replied that this was a person she had known since childhood. She didn't have a mother, but Lowina replaced her and her entire family. In the palace, no one even wanted to approach her, let alone care for her. No one talked to her, and she was very lonely. But when she turned 3, everything changed. Their first meeting took place. Lowina said that she would serve her from that day on. Ashtart was very happy about this. She greeted her new friend and said that she hoped they would get along. Lowina smiled and told the princess that she was very nice. However, the Empress's palace became more and more abandoned. The servants did not want to be in the same place with the Princess of Darkness. One day, one of the maids asked Lowina if she would really stay to work there, to which the girl said a confident yes. The maid, perplexed, asked her partner if everything was okay with her and if she had hit her head. After all, everyone else had already left to serve Princess Amaryllis, and the only reason she and Kate were still here was because they were overstaffed. Lowina asked in confusion what was wrong. The girl suddenly said that she probably didn't know because she came from the village, but the local princess was destined to become a star of darkness. The girl said that the little princess would destroy the entire Florence Empire. At that moment, a rag flew at her. Lowina came closer in confusion and asked who said that. Who is spreading the rumor that Her Highness is the Star of Darkness? The girl told her pathetic companion that even His Majesty had said nothing about this prophecy. In any case, she asked Marianne to be careful. Twirling her finger around her neck, she said that one wrong word, and she could lose her head for insulting the members of the Imperial family. Marianne decided that this girl was crazy and said that they would leave this place within a year anyway, but Lowina would regret not listening to her. Ashtart at that moment watched the maid, who asked in bewilderment how people dared to speak like that about a sweet and innocent child. Our heroine was a little shocked because this was the first time someone took her side. She felt gratitude and curiosity towards Lowina. And yet, after everything the maid had done for her, she had become a very dear person to her. The girl said with a smile on her face that even when everyone left, Lowina stayed and took care of her to this day, and she is truly grateful to her. Ashtart assumed that she was very worried about her, so she needed to return as soon as possible. As soon as the guy finished listening to the princess's story, he only sighed heavily, understanding the whole situation. With great difficulty, after some time, the guy was able to put the girl to bed. In turn, he sat at the table realizing that one very close person was waiting for Ashtart, and although it was strange, it began to worry him. He realized that he had never seen anyone think so warmly of another person before. Either way, it hasn't been that long since they met, but he wonders if she will remember him as fondly when she gets home. At that moment, Aelion heard a rustling sound and instantly raised his head. The guy asked what he wanted to tell him. The stranger said nothing, but Ryan continued to insist on talking since he had come. The boy asked the young gentleman how long he would keep this lady. Aelion, perplexed, asked since when he had become interested in their guests. The assistant wanted to say something else, but Aelion stopped him and told him to tell the chef to make strawberry sandwiches in the morning. The guy sighed heavily and said that he would listen to the young master. Rion stood by the window and once again reminded that he was no longer the young master. Turning his head, he looked at his assistant with a wild look and asked him not to forget this. Before leaving, the guy said that he would keep this in mind. In turn, Rion was left alone, and he began to examine the lily-of-the-valley hairpin. The guy suddenly thought, assuming that she most likely did not understand that the person dear to her was. Suddenly he stopped and decided that he wanted to take a walk in the garden. However, the action takes us to the day when Ashtart disappeared. To be precise, we are back in the Firenze Empire. At this time, a joyful Lowina walked with delicious pastries, assuming that the princess was very hungry, and she hoped that the girl did not faint during the walk. Suddenly, Lowina heard a familiar voice addressing His Highness. Turning her head, she saw Ashen, who was bewilderedly asking the princess to stop running away. The girl laughed, assuming that even Sir Ashen couldn't catch their restless princess. The boy continued to ask the princess to stop. However, soon the boy said something that almost made Lowina's heart stop. The captain of the guard was addressing Princess Amaryllis. The girl was confused and said that she didn't want to see him or anyone else. Ashen still followed her and tried to stop her. At this moment, Lowina, in incredible shock, asked herself only one question. Why was he with Princess Amaryllis and not with Princess Ashtart? Instantly, the basket of baked goods that the girl was making for the princess flew to the floor. The girl immediately ran after Sir Ashen and tried to stop him, but at that moment the Crown Prince of Miragein came out in front of her, so now the girl couldn't just leave. Lowina immediately bowed down, and the prince asked her if she liked the dress he had given her. The girl said that it was an honor for her to receive it. Miragein laughed at this point and asked about the honor. He asked the maid if she really thought so because he was sure that she had sent dresses for Princess Ashtart too. Remembering the words of the girl who said that the dress was made by Lowina, he asked the maid why she lied. Miragein understood that the princess thought that it was the maid who had sewn her dress. What was the reason? Lowina replied that he had not ordered her to hand over the dresses in his name. The girl spoke, but in her thoughts she tried to calm herself. She replied that for this reason she willfully allowed the princess to think that the dresses were from her. She realized that she was speaking to Miragein Firenze, the second most powerful person after the Emperor, and one of the few geniuses in the Empire who could use magic. In any case, she knew that he simply had no reason to talk to her, a pathetic servant. And yet, she asked the prince if he wanted to know the reason why she said so. She often gets angry at the Imperial family when she thinks about their treatment of Ashtart. This resentment has been building up for so long that she couldn't stop now. The girl suddenly told His Highness that it was simply mean. She apologized for her words but still did not understand the point of such kindness. They wanted to give the princess hope, and then caring about their reputation simply trample all her dreams. Lowina was leading to the conclusion that he would simply cause her much more pain. Miragein started laughing at the girl's audacity. In any case, he asked what she meant by that. At that moment, while Sir Ashen was running after Princess Amaryllis, he noticed Lowina and the Crown Prince. At that moment, the prince asked the maid in surprise if she really wanted to die that much because she should think before she said anything. But Lowina at that moment understood that even if she had to pay for her actions, she would still try to protect the princess from such two-faced people. Ashtart tried not to call the prince brother because he didn't like it, but she still couldn't help herself a few days ago. She followed the prince through a huge crowd of people around. Suddenly, Miragein stopped. The boy turned his head in confusion towards the girl and asked what she had just called him. Still, she approached Miragein and said she wanted to ask him for something. She wanted him to buy a beautiful dress for Lowina. Miragein, perplexed, asked why she was asking for a dress for the maid and not for herself. The girl replied that she loved her very much, so she wanted to give her something nice. Still, the problem was that she had nothing, so she decided to take such a bold step. The guy, of course, was perplexed, but sighing heavily, he said that he would help her. He told the girl that she could consider this gratitude for saving him. The girl was happier than anyone in the world at that moment. She thanked her brother. At this point, even Lowina couldn't hold back her tears because for a moment she had hope. She saw the princess experiencing the warmth of a family for the first time in 10 years. But at that moment the prince's face changed, and he told Ashtart that this was his last warning. He looked at her with disdain and told her not to call him brother unless she wanted to die. He asked her to address him as the Crown Prince. In front of everyone, he said that really was the only one who could call him brother. Lowina's face instantly changed, and she realized that she had only imagined that the prince had changed. No one in the Imperial family would ever show concern for Ashtart, and frankly, she despised them all. In her head, she was constantly indignant, asking what bad thing Princess Ashtart had done to them. Lowina only asked the prince to treat the princess as before, that is, completely ignoring her existence and lacking interest in her life. She begged him not to give Ashtart hope so that later it would hurt even more. Miragein laughed at that moment because the maid, instead of apologizing, decided to start giving advice. Raising his head, he shouted, telling the girl that she had gone too far. So there are only 2 princes of the Firenze Empire, Miragein and Noah, but even such people had one limitation. Based on the prophecy of the high priest Horiom, it contained a terrible prediction. The man asked not to blindly believe the prophecy, but still one thing had to be observed. It was necessary to stay away from the palace where the Princess of Darkness was born. Therefore, even though the baby's mother, the Empress, died immediately after giving birth, no one visited the princess for the next 10 years. After all, the Star of Darkness will swallow the light and lead the Empire to destruction. Naturally, many people were sure that Amaryllis was the light. Of course, Prince Miragein was no exception to the rule until recently. Sitting at the table, the guy was writing something, but thoughts about Ashtart, who looked at him so sweetly and thanked him, were flying through his head. Because he sat and thought about one thing for too long, he even managed to spill the ink. At that moment, a guy approached him and said that Miragein seemed to be in a bad mood today. Looking at Noah, the guy said that it was nonsense. In fact, in front of him stood his brother, the second prince of the Ferenzi Empire. Miragein looked at him and said that he was back early anyway. He was wondering how things were going. Noah said that he was keeping an eye on him, but he was surprisingly cautious. Still, if it was the one who injured Miragein, it was expected that he would go into hiding. That very evening, when our heroine found her brother, he was lying in his own pool of blood. Just remembering that night, a whole bunch of goosebumps ran through Miragein's body. Soon, a maid knocked on the door and told His Highness that all the dresses had been prepared, according to the order for the maid of the Empress's palace. Noah was very surprised, so he looked at his brother and asked what dresses they were talking about. The maid asked the prince if he needed anything else, to which the boy simply asked to send the dresses to the Empress's palace. And yet at that moment, he decided that he had forgotten almost the most important thing, so he asked the maid to stop. In turn, Noah was still surprised because before his brother had never hidden his orders from him. Miragein told the maid to prepare more dresses for the princess. The girl asked in surprise, and the prince asked in bewilderment, did she really not hear him? Slammed the table and repeated his order, saying that he had ordered dresses to be prepared for Princess Ashtart. Noah, perplexed, asked his brothers what he was doing and why he was giving Ashtart dresses, to which Miragein replied that he had his reasons and that it would never happen again. In any case, Lowina at that moment realized that she had acted very stupidly. Looking at the prince, she immediately assumed that she would be hanged for disrespect, and then the princess would be left alone. However, the prince said that he would pretend that he had not heard anything, but next time she would lose her head for something like that. The maid began to raise her head in bewilderment, not understanding why he held back. The guy suddenly asked her if she knew why he didn't punish her despite all the impudent words he said to her. Lowina looked at him and said that she didn't know. As he started walking towards her, he said that Ashtart was wearing shabby clothes, but she asked her to buy a dress for Lowina. As he passed by, he said that Lowina was very dear to Princess Ashtart. She may see this as an act of mercy for a member of the Imperial family, but he nevertheless told her to know her place in the future. After some time, the prince left, and Ashen began to approach the girl, telling her that she was too reckless. The guy exhaled heavily, saying that it was simply a miracle that she was able to stay alive after everything she said. Still, if she was truly worried about the princess, it would be better not to do this again. Only at that very moment the girl turned on the captain of the guard and asked why he abandoned Princess Ashtart. The boy replied that he had accompanied the princess as they had agreed, but afterward the prince ordered him to follow Princess Amaryllis. He also added that if she doesn't believe, then they can go to the gazebo together. At this time, the action takes us to our heroine and Aelion, who went out for a walk. The first thing the girl noticed in the garden were the wonderful lilies of the valley. Ashtart admired their beauty. And still looking at the gazebo, near which the boys were, the girl noticed that it looked familiar, and this garden full of white flowers also seemed familiar. She immediately thought that it reminded her of the lily garden in the palace, and of course Amaryllis. But to her horror, our heroine began to feel her head in bewilderment, trying to find the hairpin, but it was not there. She started to wonder where the hairpin had gone. She always wore it. It was a gift from Lowina. Where could it have gone? At that moment, the guy looked at the confused girl and guessed what she was thinking about. In any case, he touched her shoulder and decided to distract her from the thoughts that were in her head. He suggested going to the gazebo because he had brought sandwiches that she liked. Ashtart asked in confusion if he was talking about strawberry sandwiches. After some time, our heroine ate and asked Rian why he was so kind to her. She admitted that she was not used to being treated like that and did not even know what to say. Looking at the girl, he asked if he had already spoken about this. She reminded him of someone. Well, the reason why he is nice to you is personal, but you can still consider it to be just kindness. As for what to say he decided to help the girl, he explained that in such situations people usually say thank you. Ashtart looked at him in surprise and said thank you. She thought that Rion was a wonderful person indeed, and yet looking at those chains she didn't understand why he was in shackles. She wanted him to be comfortable. As she began to stretch, she even thought about taking them off. Anyway, she asked Ryan if he was comfortable in them. At first, she thought he was a criminal, but he can leave the house without any problems. And besides, he had a lot of delicious food, so she asked if he minded if she took them off. After all, Ryan wears shackles despite the fact that he has not committed any crime, which is quite strange in her opinion. The guy smiled at that moment and asked if she would really do this for him. The girl smiled happily and said that she would help because she was sure that there was a spell that could help her with this. She immediately stood up thinking to find it. However, at that moment, to our heroine's surprise, the guy grabbed her hand and stopped her. Looking at Ashtart, he asked her if she really thought he would fall for this trick. At that very moment, an awkward pause hung in the air and did not dissipate. The girl suddenly started talking about how she really wanted to help him. However, the guy started laughing and saying that she was 100% trying to get her magic book back. Ashtart was shocked that her plan was revealed so quickly and abruptly. Even if she wanted to help in her subconscious, she assumed that this way she could get her book. Only Aelion insisted to the princess that she still needed rest. He explained to her that when using magic, a person must give something of equal value in return, and ignoring proper rest would only harm her body. That's why it didn't matter to him what she said, because he wasn't going to return the book anyway. Ashtart took her hand away and told the guy that he was just a fool. She really was worried about him. Still, the guy said he appreciated that she wanted to help him, but he wasn't going to remove the shackles just yet. He explained that if he didn't wear them, some people would become scared and very anxious. Hearing these words, our heroine began to worry even more because who would worry? She assumed that it was about Ryan's family, but why be afraid of such a kind person like him? At that moment, our heroine asked him if he really wanted to live his whole life like this. Aelion at that moment looked into the distance and said that he didn't even know, maybe he could. The guy wanted to say something else, but at that moment Ashtart screamed as if in despair and began to say that he couldn't live like this. How could he like it? Living alone and locked up, no one wants to spend their whole life and die in lonely confinement. She experienced something similar herself, and she knows this feeling. And it wasn't all that simple. Our heroine felt this on herself, both from this life and from a past life. In her past life, she didn't even have a name, and so she couldn't introduce herself. Back then, she wasn't a princess like she is. Now she was a slave who was constantly being resold. By the way, the Viscount to whom she was sold had children who liked her very much. But the problem was that for them, she was just an unusual toy. They liked to make fun of her to mock her, and the more she suffered, the happier they were. She was already starting to get used to it, but one day the boys were deciding what to do with her, but they realized that their toy had been too sluggish lately. The girl suddenly suggested that they needed to do something worse. And yes, they took such a terrible step that the girl didn't even want to remember, and yet she didn't know that they could go so far. The worst thing was that she was all alone, and she just writhed in pain for a long time, trying to find at least some help. She asked for at least someone to save her. But no matter how much she called for help, no one came to her aid and there was no one to save her. In the end, she went to another world being completely alone. And the only miracle was that before her death, she tearfully made a wish. In the next life, she wanted to be born into a family that would love her. She wanted to dedicate her life to protecting and caring for them, and so she is Ashtart, a human with memories of a past life. And of course, from the moment she was born, the girl wanted only one thing. She wanted to meet a loving family. But unfortunately, the girl's story is known to everyone in this world, which means she could only watch her family from the shadows. She could only recall over and over again the conversation with her brother when she asked if she was a sister to them. Ashtart remembered for the rest of her life the look of her brother, the crown prince, who told her to stop looking at him and calling him brother, remembering all the terrible things that happened to her in her past life and what was happening in this one. The girl felt incredibly painful in her soul. And yet, at that moment, the girl came to her senses because someone was diligently trying to pull her out of their memories. Of course, it was Aelion who was scared for the girl and asked if she was okay. Ashtart said, a little embarrassed, that everything was fine and that she was just too withdrawn. The guy sighed heavily because he felt that deep down the girl was in pain, but he didn't know why. In any case, he said that he would try to do, as she says, he will not live locked up, although he is not exactly in captivity, of course. Our heroine was very glad that he listened to her and decided to draw some conclusions. Suddenly, Aelion turned his head and asked the girl if she liked lilies of the valley. Our heroine asked him in surprise what he was talking about, and the guy at that moment continued to look at the flowers and said that his family liked them. The girl was a little surprised because every time Ryan talks about family, he has a very cold look and a sad smile. That's why Ashtart thought that he might be dreaming of family warmth just like she was. Meanwhile, the action moves to Ashen, who sighed heavily and said that he could probably forget about rest. After the incident in the lily garden, troubles appeared in the palace again, and it was all because of one thing that Amaryllis said in front of the Emperor. At the table, the girl said that she met her sister Ashtart, and she shared that she asked Ashtart to borrow her hairpin, but she refused. Of course, she didn't say that her sister was a bad child, since most likely there was a misunderstanding. And yet the girl told her father that she wanted the same hair clip as Ashtart, and even better. Soon, the Emperor sent men to find the most beautiful hairpin in the country, and rumors spread throughout the palace that Princess Ashtart hated Princess Amaryllis. All the people said that the prophecy was true. Ashen sighed heavily, wondering for a moment if Lowina and Ashtart had returned safe and sound. And yet, raising his head, the boy thought that it was very cool, that at least here it was quite quiet. He supposed that it was because there was no person who broke in here every day. It was all about the maid Lowina, who loved to run to him and complain about something. She always came and complained about the palace. It even got to the point that she was nicknamed a walking disaster. And yet the guy sighed, opening the door, and thought that it was even good that today he could be calm. But as soon as he opened the door, he came face to face with a frightened Lowina. The guy, perplexed, began to ask what had happened again, but the girl interrupted him and began to beg him for help. The girl told him that she still could not find Princess Ashtart. The guy's tone immediately changed, and what's more, he froze like a statue. At this time, the girl continued to scream, asking what they should do, because the princess was missing. Ashen asked again in confusion what had happened, to which the girl continued to ask him for help in a desperate voice. The guy took Lowina by the shoulders and asked her to calm down, saying that it would be better for her to tell what happened. He wanted to know exactly when the princess had disappeared, to which the maid began to say that she had done as he had told her. She went to the pavilion in the lily garden and was just horrified by what had happened there. She wasn't there anyway, so she returned to the Empress's palace in hope, Ashen thought, assuming that the girl had been missing since then, but if only he could escort her back. He immediately began to feel guilty about what had happened because hadn't he promised to help her? From the day Her Highness appeared here, one day Lowina, as usual, burst into the palace addressing Sir Ashen, saying that this was too much. The girl asked in bewilderment what the guards were doing while the intruder had entered the Empress's palace. Ashtart at this moment just looked at Lowina and worried that she was so angry. However, the people in the palace were frightened at that moment because they saw a star of darkness in front of them. They began to whisper in bewilderment, realizing that the girl's hair was really black, and they were even afraid to look at her. And yet the captain of the guard immediately ordered everyone to shut up. He bowed down and, turning to the princess, asked what brought her to this wretched place. As a knight, he should have been extremely polite in front of the Imperial family, even if this girl was the Princess of Darkness. In any case, Ashtart began to talk about everything in bewilderment. The girl said that she was just following Lowina and ended up here, and still she apologized for interrupting their training. Lowina said that she didn't need to apologize because it was all because the knights weren't doing their job well. Ashen was confused about how the maid was getting on his nerves. In any case, she said that the intruder the princess saw was wounded and could not get far. The guy asked in surprise if she had really seen him herself. He immediately asked if he had a hood on or if he was covering his face with something. And yet she shook her head, saying only what she remembered, that he had silver hair and was very handsome. As Ashen began to analyze what was said, he assumed that the princess was meeting the crown prince of Miragein for the first time. After some time, he told the prince everything, and he asked in bewilderment if he really wanted to say that he was that person. Ashen bowed down and began to apologize, but still, from the day they met, everything began to change. In any case, he looked at Ashtart and said that he should say thank you for the help he had given. As far as he knew, she had stopped the bleeding, and he supposed he should also thank him for covering him with some torn things. He said that he had originally intended to convey his thanks through Sir Ashen, but since they had met again, he wanted to know what she wanted, and he would give it to her. Our heroine approached him and asked if she could have the dress, a very beautiful dress. Ashen was very surprised that the girl asked for a simple dress for saving the life of the crown prince. The guy folded his hands and accepted the request, but still he couldn't repay her for saving him with just one dress. He added that he would send several models in her size. Could it really be that a simple dress was the cause of everything? At that moment, our heroine began to call her brother, who was about to leave. The girl ran towards him, while Sir Ashen thought that most likely it was not about the dress at all. The guy at that moment turned around in confusion, asking what she had just said, but Ashtart gestured for him to bend down. All the people around started whispering, and the knights were completely shocked by what had happened. Ashen didn't know what exactly she whispered to the prince, but he could feel it. The knight knew anyway that those who met the princess would change, even including the crown prince of Miragein. Well, if this can be called changes, then even Princess Amaryllis is changing, and yet Princess Ashtart even made the steadfast maid cry from fear and worry. All the knight could do at that moment was hug the girl and try to help her calm down. He tried to bring her to her senses, asking how she was going to find the princess in such a state. Ashen told her that this was not like her at all, asking what happened to that fearless girl who argued with the crown prince himself. However, at this point the girl was still able to tell him something, and all she said was that she couldn't breathe. The guy immediately apologized and stepped aside, which allowed the girl to finally catch her breath. After a while, Ashen asked the maid if she had calmed down a little. The guy told her that she had to go right now and that she needed to prepare everything for the princess's return. Lowina, in tears, raised her head and thanked Sir Ashen for his support. The girl said that in that case she would go and make sweet milk, after which she would wait for her, since the princess loved him very much. In turn, the knight began to walk forward, saying that it was time for him to go, and the girl followed suit by saying that she was counting on him. The action moves to the evening when the sun was setting and the moon was about to rise over the palace. At this time, the maids were standing in the corridor and whispering about something. They were talking about good craftsmen. They were discussing Princess Amaryllis's hairpin. They wondered what design would be best, and the material had to be of the highest quality. They even had a list of the best workshops, and she heard that all the famous people were there. The maid at that moment told her partner that she had done a great job because they would be the first to prepare the hairpin, and at that moment the girl fell silent because she noticed that she was not alone. Prince Noah stood before them. The girls immediately wondered if the prince had heard their conversation, but the guy wasn't going to say anything and just walked past the girls. Looking at his back, they sighed heavily, saying that he had only scared them a lot. One of the maids looked at her friend in surprise and asked if he was worried about the rumors. Her friend looked at her in surprise and asked what rumors she was talking about. The girl said that she heard that Princess Amaryllis had recently met Princess Ashtart and that she had mercilessly brought her to tears. In horror, the maid asked what had happened, and her friend said that the Princess of Darkness had cruelly and brazenly accused the Princess of Light, and their poor princess had run away in tears. But what's most surprising is that according to others, Princess Ashtart did all this because of a hairpin. Noah heard all these words. The guy was surprised by what all the people were talking about because it all just didn't fit in his head. After a while, he got out to his favorite place. Lying on the roof, he thought that Ashtart did not look like a person capable of such a thing. And what's more, something amazing happened at this very place one day. He heard the maid addressing the princess. Looking down, the boy noticed Lowina telling the girl that she needed to go get food and that she should stay here. Ashtart asked in surprise why she could not go with her. The maid replied that she would go alone and return immediately. This turn of events, of course, did not make the girl very happy, but there was nothing else to do but wait. At that moment, the girl grabbed her hair and started screaming that her clothes were dirty, and her hands were dirty too. She cried and asked herself, does everyone hate her because she is dirty? And yet this child whom he had never seen before was called a princess. Noah somehow immediately understood who it was by her black hair. Approaching the girl, he asked what she was doing. Already standing right in front of the girl, the guy asked her in surprise to remind him what her name was. Ashtart introduced herself and said that she was sitting in her place and waiting for her maid. The guy looked around again in surprise and asked if she was just waiting here. The girl looked at him and said that everything was right. Noah at that moment only wondered what was so dangerous about this girl. Anyway, the guy threw a cloak over her and said that if she was going to sit here, she should at least take cover. The girl began to sheepishly say that it was very generous of him, but could she? Noah interrupted her at that moment and asked her to think of it as a duty of a family member. Anyway, the guy suggested that they meet again sometime. He was interested in learning more about her. By the way, it was funny to remember that the girl said that it was too generous for her. What kind of princess would she be then? The action moves to childhood. At that moment, the woman told the prince one thing that he had to remember. He must become the perfect emperor. The girl was ruthless and told Miragein to be just as ruthless, to show no sympathy to anyone. His mother's words sounded like a terrible dream, especially when she called his name. Just at that moment, the guy jumped up in a cold sweat, happily realizing that it was just a dream. Soon he even laughed, asking why he had to have this particular nightmare. At that moment, he leaned back in his chair, repeating one name, Rosignation. She might have been a good empress, but she certainly wasn't a good mother. So, Resignation, this is the mother who spanked her child to make him the perfect emperor. And yet she soon died of her illness. Miragein simply went with the flow and did not see much meaning in life. At first, he had no interest in the birth of the two princesses, but at the insistence of the high priest of Horiom, he came to see the Princess of Light. The guy, who was initially not in any mood, immediately froze as soon as he saw her in front of him. Before him was a pure-hearted, beautiful, and sweet girl named Amaryllis. The girl was too innocent. She loved to learn new things and was happy with nature. And yet Miragein absolutely did not believe in the prophecy, although he tried to be a good brother. He was always on her side and tried to bring a smile to Amaryllis's face. But still, he wanted to believe that this child was the light that all the people around him were talking about. He thought so until he met a girl who was happy with everything that surrounded her, even despite the terrible conditions. Miragein remembered how the Princess of Darkness called him brother, and it caused a very strange feeling in him. He thought or hoped that this feeling would subside if he set boundaries with her, but sitting in his office alone with his thoughts, he only wondered what this strange feeling was. Anyway, there was a knock at the door, so immediately the prince ordered the guest to come in. On the threshold was a worried Sir Ashen. With a heavy sigh, the prince said that he was not in the mood right now, so he asked the guy to leave, but he said something that shocked him. Ashen interrupted His Majesty and said that Princess Ashtart had disappeared without a trace. The prince, perplexed, asked how this was possible and also asked when she had last been seen. The guy apologized, saying that he didn't know exactly when or how it happened. However, all he knew was that from the maid's words, the girl simply did not return from a walk in the lily garden. At that moment, the prince felt even worse than he had before, because that tearing feeling appeared again. Holding his heart, he thought that he just felt like he hated this child. Then why did his soul feel so bad? In any case, the prince asked the captain of the guard if he understood correctly that the girl disappeared immediately after this incident. Ashen asked for clarification, to which Miragein asked if she had disappeared after drinking tea with Amaryllis. The guy sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, this was indeed the case. Miragein was of course worried, but he told the captain of the guard that it would be easier to find someone who had disappeared recently. He also added that they could use magic to track her location. Only when he opened the drawer where the book with magic spells usually lay did the prince realize that the book was not there. The prince was undoubtedly surprised by this incident, but raising his head, he asked Ashen if he had accidentally taken his book of magic. The boy asked in confusion what he was talking about, to which Miragein sighed, realizing that he hadn't taken her. In that case, he told the captain he could go. Ashen was about to leave the prince's office, but at that moment, Miragein turned to him. Looking at him, the crown prince said that it would be better not to tell anyone about this so as not to cause panic. In any case, he asked to find the princess, and he can search the entire empire, but he must find her. The guy just nodded his head. As soon as the captain of the guard left the office, the prince asked in bewilderment what was happening to him. Not only had he lost the book, but in such a situation. While the guy was wondering where he could have put it, our heroine was actively researching spells, for example. Now she came across holy magic. Its effect is amazing because this magic can transfer to the person who misses it. At that moment, Ryan seemed to sneak up on her and asked the girl if she was actively studying again. The girl said that she didn't want to be a burden to him anymore, but the guy said that he didn't think that way about her. Ashtart replied that he said that because he was kind. The guy laughed and said that she was the only one who thought so. Ashtart added in surprise that he gave her clothes, fed her well, and took her to beautiful places. Ryan sighed heavily and suggested that if he was so kind, then it was time to return the hairpin to her. Just as the boy was about to hand over the hairpin, the girl said that she had found a spell that would help her return back. Smiling, Ashtart asked him not to worry because this time everything would work out. At that moment, Aelion simply froze because he didn't expect her to do everything so quickly. And yet she was amazing from their first meeting, but she never ceases to amaze him. Ryan suddenly asked if this magic would really transport her to someone who missed her. He didn't expect that such a thing was included in Sibling magic at all. The girl asked in surprise what similar meant. The guy laughed at that moment and said that it was just thinking out loud. However, the holy language of Sibling is the language of auxiliary magic used in the temple. This is magic that can create force fields, blessings, or healing. The guy didn't understand what use magic was that teleported to someone who missed you, and what's more, if no one needed him. He assumed that this magic was for the truly lucky ones. However, at that moment, the girl began to pronounce the name. Ryan realized that if she used that spell, it only meant that someone missed her. And our heroine knew only one such person in her memory, and it was undoubtedly Lowina. It was this girl who protected the princess from all troubles and was able to speak to her for the first time with a smile on her face. At this moment, Ryan was seriously scared because he wondered, what if the girl could really come back now? Soon a magical portal began to open in which Lowina was indeed visible. The girl began to scream with tears in her eyes and asked the maid if she could hear her. In any case, she started running forward, telling the girl that she was already running towards her. But at that moment, something unexpected happened because Ryan suddenly screamed and asked Ashtart to stop. The girl continued to run, and the guy said something trying to protect her. Soon our heroine was as close as possible to that, and it seemed that Ashtart and Lowina would finally meet soon. However, at that very moment, Ryan ran up to her and simply grabbed her, not giving her the opportunity to even move. The girl looked at Ryan in bewilderment and began to ask what he was doing because Lowina was sitting there. The guy in turn continued to hold her and apologize because he couldn't let her go. It was impossible. Ashtart still didn't understand what was happening, but at that moment she clearly felt the magic dissipating. A few moments later, the magical portal began to close right in front of the girl's face, who was screaming and asking to be let in. Ryan told the girl that it was dangerous for her because it was a spell. It was unsuccessful according to him. He sighed heavily and said that he thought she should go back into the building and rest. The girl in turn continued to scream in bewilderment and say that she almost succeeded. Our heroine began to cast the spell again because she was sure that this time she would succeed. Soon the image of her favorite maid began to appear before the girl, which meant that she had succeeded. Aelion nevertheless continued to ask her to stop because she was making a mistake. In turn, our heroine began to reach out to Lowina, thinking that she would soon be home. However, within a moment her hopes were shattered. A loud and shocked scream was heard a few seconds later. Suddenly, the girl became lost in what was happening around her for some reason. Everything became dark and her head felt like it was about to explode. A moment later, the girl simply fell down, continuing to repeat the name of her maid. The guy grabbed her and began asking if she was okay. The girl's body seemed so heavy for some reason, and yet at the end she said that she hoped that this time everything would work out for her. Sighing heavily with the last of her strength, she said that she needed to go home. Ryan hugged the girl and said that he knew it. Then he apologized for disturbing her. By the way, he knew that if a third party intentionally breaks the spell, the magician will experience a strong backlash. Even though he knew all this, according to her, it was said that this spell would help her find her destiny. Taking her in his arms, he continued to ask for forgiveness, even from the unconscious Ashtart, saying that he knew it was selfish, but he was not ready to let her go. At that moment, the boy turned to the man standing behind the tree and asked if he would say that would he believe that he would not harm this child. Behind the tree stood the captain of his knightly army whose name was Kylos and Kavan. Kylos knelt down and asked for forgiveness from his lordship, as he had only come to check out the situation, as he had felt a strange flow of magic. Aelion asked the captain of the knightly army if he had eavesdropped on the conversation, to which the boy replied that the lady was not from their country. He himself was sure that Aelion knew about this, so she couldn't stay here forever. He was worried. Ryan laughed at this point, asking who he was worried about, him or the girl. Was he afraid that he would fall into a mad rage again? Turning around, the guy laughed, saying that this would be very useful for the Elferman killer. And yet Kylos spoke of his bewilderment about this young lady because several strange incidents had happened. She was dressed in the clothes of a noble lady, but said that she would sleep in the very corner because she was comfortable there. Ryan even said that the girl thinks that the ability to fast is her special talent. It was clear that this lady was completely incapable of responding to kindness. He thought that maybe she was being bullied because of some unusual power she possessed. And yet he continued to see a little of himself in her. At that moment, Kylos could not hold back his tears. Meanwhile, the action takes us to Lowina, who all this time was trying to wait for the princess but fell asleep at the table. Suddenly, she dreamed of something amazing, how some very familiar voice was calling her. At that very moment, her eyes opened, and she wondered whose voice it could be. Lowina immediately jumped up from the table and began calling for Her Highness, hoping that she was nearby. However, all that surrounded her were empty walls that morally oppressed Lowina. With a heavy sigh, the girl realized that it was just a dream which was not reality. And yet, looking out the window, she realized that she had fallen asleep, although she did not want to do so. In any case, it was late, and she hoped that Sir Ashen had some news. Looking at the cup of milk that the girl held with her trembling hands, she smoothly moved into her memories. She once asked if the princess needed help, to which Ashtart replied that she could easily handle it herself. Lowina laughed and said that she was sure that the princess still had a hard time doing things, and yet she was so stubborn. In any case, she stroked the girl's head, saying that she was very proud of her. Tears involuntarily flowed into the same cup one after another. The girl hit the table, realizing that if she had known all this, had known how everything would be, she would have protected the princess like the apple of her eye. How could she not feel that something had happened to her? She asked herself this question as she slammed the table over and over again, blaming herself for letting it go to waste. She continued to cry, talking about how she had promised that man that she would protect the princess. Fortunately, the girl eventually decided to come to her senses, so when she started breathing, she calmed down. And what's more, right at that moment, someone knocked on the door, which gave rise to faith in something good. The girl raised her head in bewilderment, not understanding who could have come so late. However, as soon as she suggested that it might be the Princess Lowina jumped up from the table, she assumed that the girl could have simply gotten lost and wandered for a long time in an unfamiliar place. With these thoughts, the girl approached the door, and as soon as she opened it, she decided to greet the princess. But she was in for a disappointment, because it was not she who stood before her but Sir Ashen. The girl began to ask if he had found her, if there was any news about the princess. She did not believe that there was nothing at all. However, the guy sighed heavily and confessed who had actually come to her. At this moment, the crown prince emerged from the bushes and said that there was something about the princess that he wanted to ask Lowina personally. The girl's face instantly changed, and she asked His Highness what brought him here. Moreover, she was more surprised by what the high priest told him, because he ordered not to enter the empress's palace. Miragein himself remembered exactly how the high priest addressed him, saying all these words. At that moment, the door began to close, but Miragein grabbed it and began to speak. The guy said that if he had already been here once, then he could come here a second time. And of course we knew that he was already here, but he was not here of his own free will. And yet, as soon as he visited this place, everything in his life began to go wrong. The action is postponed for some time. Miragein was sitting in his office and asked the high priest in surprise why he came. The man asked in surprise, did he really have a reason to visit him after all? His Highness is the little son of the Empire. Miragein immediately said that if he wanted something, he had better hurry up and say it right away. The man laughed and assumed that the prince was in a bad mood. The man wished for the prince to receive divine inspiration today. Having explained, he specified that the dangerous man should approach Princess Amaryllis. The high priest hoped that the prince would protect the Princess of Light. Miragein only sighed heavily. He found it amusing to hear something about divine inspiration, and the influence of the high priest had grown significantly since the time of the prophecy, so his predictions were completely believed. Miragein repeated the man's words and asked if he really wanted him to take on such an important role as protecting the Princess of Light. The high priest laughed and asked if he knew of any other magicians who were more talented than him. And yet Miragein was absolutely sure that if we were talking about strong magicians, then there was another one, someone with potential far beyond his own magical powers. If the high priest had spoken to Noah then, he would without a doubt do everything possible to protect the Princess of Light, their beautiful and sweet little sister. Also, before leaving, the priest said that Princess Amaryllis asked him to personally deliver a message. She would like to have tea with her brother. He didn't know what was going on in the high priest's head, but really was like family to him. He wouldn't put her in danger, so he'd have to indulge him. And yet, standing in front of the palace, the prince felt something unfamiliar, and therefore he had a bad feeling. Meanwhile, something terrible was really happening in the palace because some invader was pointing a dagger at the princess's head. Prince Miragein instantly ran to his sister and began to protect her, covering her with his body. However, the killer did not expect, or rather did not want, anyone to interfere with his plan. And still laughing, he asked who it was that had come to their party. He laughed after a few moments, telling the guy that he was most likely the crown prince of Miragein. The prince was shocked at this point that the killer knew him, and the maid surrounded the lady and asked if she was okay. The boy continued to laugh, asking His Highness not to be too surprised. After all, he just came to check something. And yet this guy really irritated Miragein. He didn't like the energy that emanated from this man. Perhaps he should get rid of him right away. The guy started talking about how everyone in this empire knows that the crown prince is a great magician. And what's more, everyone says that he is especially skilled. Since he is so talented and has Rajzek attack magic, he would like to show off the spell he learned. The killer also added that he learned this spell specifically for their little son of the Empire. Miragein was very angry at this moment because he knew that he couldn't use magic recklessly. If he made one false move, Riley and her maids would suffer, and yet he knew that this stranger was incredibly dangerous. In any case, the boy raised his blade and assumed that the boy was too confident to come here alone. The prince asked not to disappoint him. Anyway, he added that otherwise the stranger would die. The guy started screaming and laughing, saying that it would be the greatest honor. At that very moment, the boy recited the spell, and soon after Miragein was horrified because he knew what it did. Instantly, everything around began to break, crack, and shards from the windows flew towards the princess. However, as soon as the girls opened their eyes, they realized that it was all protective magic. The guy laughed, saying that his techniques were too obvious and he was able to defend himself from everything. However, he still didn't notice one fragment because it went straight into his stomach. Amaryllis began to scream in horror, telling her brother that he was hurt. She wanted to break free and do something. Only the prince immediately ordered his sister to stay in the protective barrier. The girl continued to shout something, but Miragein no longer heard or saw anything. Afterwards, he tried to catch the intruder, but in that state he could do nothing. He lost consciousness when he used up his powers and woke up not realizing how much time had passed. The guy sighed heavily, trying to look around, but he understood that he had most likely missed the killer. Soon his eyes began to close again, and all he could think about was hoping that Riley was okay. However, something happened that he certainly could not have expected. After a while, his eyes began to open again. The prince knew that he had to go back, but at that moment he began to hear someone's screams. Some voice was calling Lowina, saying that something had happened to this stranger. Opening his eyes, he saw a silhouette that made him wonder, was that meeting a mistake or was it fate? Our heroine sat over her brother and asked with confusion how he was feeling. But what happened in that room before the prince lost consciousness? First of all, the boy realized that he had let his guard down. And yet at that moment, the stranger began to cough, which begged the question, what was wrong with him? In any case, the guy was saying that he thought this spell was perfect. However, he decided that the spell was not complete, and at that moment the prince immediately understood everything. A mage can experience side effects from a spell in two cases. The first is that the spell was interrupted, and the second is that the spell was mistranslated. The prince was shocked that this guy decided to use magic despite the great risk. In any case, the guy turned to the prince and said that he could not come to terms with such a failure, but one way or another he said that he would have to finish for today. The stranger headed towards the balcony. Miragein was shocked that this guy decided to let him go. At that moment, the prince used his last strength to cast an attack spell. The guy staggered at that moment because in the blink of an eye, his hand was enveloped by a snake that was about to bite him. However, despite the spell, the stranger managed to use something that allowed him to evaporate. The prince was incredibly angry about this, and Amaryllis turned to her brother in surprise. The guy smiled and apologized, saying that he was very sorry, but it looked like their tea party would have to be postponed. After some time, he moved through his pain, realizing that he had never seen this spell. It was an ancient language that he had never heard before, and he immediately decided to exclude Rochek because he knew it perfectly. The prince also knew a little about Sensiberian, which meant there was only one language left, that was Wayrak. Miragein was clearly convinced that he needed to deal with this guy immediately. If he manages to master this spell, he might no longer be able to protect Riley. And yet, after a few moments, the prince opened his eyes, not understanding where he was. The guy was surprised and wondered had he really lost consciousness. At that moment, he noticed a girl next to him who seemed to be the same age as Riley, and what's more, a child with black hair. He immediately realized that this was Princess Ashtart. The guy was perplexed by the fact that the princess had such a shabby dress. Then he looked back and noticed a whole pile of cloth that was bloody, meaning that the girl had treated his wound. After looking around some more, the guy laughed because he realized what kind of place this was, and it was strange that of all the places he could have ended up, he ended up in the Empress's palace. At that very moment, he began to reach out to the girl, realizing that she was the very darkness that everyone was telling him to avoid. And yet at that moment, it was as if the spirit of his mother appeared behind him, reminding him that he should not feel pity, he should be cold. He didn't understand why he was thinking about it. It wasn't like him, but anyway, he wouldn't see this child again, so he would just pretend it never happened. Miragein was only sure that they both should live as before. Somehow, he thought that once he left, that would be the end. But he went to look for Sir Ashen, and they met again. Miragein talked about how she needed to repay him for the help he received. Lowina asked the prince in bewilderment if he had really come here just to say this, but the prince replied that that was not all. The guy said that she herself told him to leave the princess alone, which is what he had been doing until now, and if he could have it his way, he would have done it. And yet, he was interested in something else. The guy began to examine the abandoned palace of the Empress. He cried out in bewilderment and asked what these ruins were and how the princess could live here. Looking at the Ashtarte maid, he said that he had to see everything for himself, so he asked to be taken to the princess's room. Soon they started to climb to the second floor, but Ashen almost fell on one of the steps. The guy asked in confusion if it was dangerous. However, the maid replied that they simply did not have the funds to fix it. She tried asking for more money but never heard back from the palace. So it all led to the fact that the winters were always cold here and their stomachs were empty. And lastly, to make the prince feel even worse, the girls said that their hearts were constantly squeezed with sadness. Lowina also explained that she has been watching the princess all this time, clinging to the hope that she will one day meet her family. And yet, she turned around saying that the princess was completely incapable of being offended by people, and she was afraid that someone might cause her too much pain. After some time, they came to the princess's room, and the girl opened the door to His Highness. At that very moment, he saw a half-ruined room. Yes, a decent room, if you think of it as a servant's room and not as a room belonging to a member of the royal family. He wondered if no one knew about the deplorable state of the palace. Soon the boy remembered how the girl said that she had almost nothing. The prince simply did not know how bad things were for her, because the princess did not even have money for dresses, except for those he gave her. There were old and worn-out dresses. Bitterness and pain squeezed the prince's heart from the realization that the princess wore the same clothes all the time. The clothes she covered herself with looked much cleaner than this. At that moment, he remembered how in front of everyone he thanked the princess for covering him with some torn things. He was just wondering why he said that nonsense, but nevertheless at that moment he noticed something unusual. One single thing caught his eye that was significantly different from the others. Grabbing his brother's cloak, the prince asked in confusion why it was there. The guy turned to the maid and ordered her to answer his question about where she got it. He had no doubt that this was the robe that Noah always wore. It was now that the prince realized that Noah had not worn his robe at all lately. The guy began to assume that his brother had met Ashtart, but then why didn't he tell him about it? Lowina suddenly said that it didn't matter because she had asked the princess many times to throw it all away. The prince asked what she was talking about, and the girl said that she was talking about the robe. The girl said that she wanted the princess to throw it away, but the princess considered it the first gift she had received from her family, so she treasured it. The action takes us back some time. The girl asked what the princess had in her hands. Was it really the crown prince? But Ashtart said it was someone else. Lowina asked again in surprise, to which the girl said that he gave it to her and said that it was his family duty. The girl even asked if it was too clean, otherwise she wouldn't be able to wear it as she was afraid that it would get dirty. At this moment the maid, perplexed, asked the princess if she really loved His Majesty and the princes despite the fact that she had never seen them. Our heroine asked in surprise what was wrong, and Lowina, perplexed, asked if she really couldn't help but love them even if she begged for it. The prince at this point angrily interrupted Lowina and asked what Ashtart had answered. The girl said that she wanted it, but it was not easy for her to change the way she felt. These were the words that the princess said. Lowina started to cry, and Ashtart comforted her, saying that she had taught her this to love no matter what. The girl asked how she could hate them. The prince cried out in bewilderment and asked if that was really why she lied to the princess. She just didn't want to give false hope, and that's why she lied about the dresses? The maid replied that this was indeed the case. And then she added that His Highness could not turn back time. She explained that this was why she wanted the girl to simply forget everything and not get attached. Miragein realized that all this was weighing heavily on his soul. He was angry and made it clear that he was not in a friendly mood. However, he also knew that all these unknown feelings scared him, but the question was different. Will he be able to justify himself despite everything that the princess had to go through? He immediately began to think that he could at least once contact her if he did it. However, after a few moments, the guy without further ado simply began to laugh. Suddenly he declared that he now understood everything for sure. He began to analyze everything that had happened and all the factors. Ashtart's worn-out dresses and her tears. It wasn't that he didn't notice, it was that he didn't care. But at the same time, something drew him to her. An unknown force made him want to see her again. Moreover, the unexpected meeting made him happy, and it seems that at that moment he already subconsciously accepted her as a sister. But when he heard the request for a dress for Lowina, he was angry at those who did not help her. And when she called him her brother, he felt guilty because he never cared about her. At that very moment, the guy knew for sure that he just wanted to see her smile. A moment later, tears began to roll down the prince's cheeks, and he only realized that he regretted everything because he was guilty. And yet the action finally takes us to our heroine, who has been unconscious all this time. Suddenly, the girl began to wake up. The first thing she saw was Ryan, who was happy to see her. The girl asked in confusion if she had really lost consciousness again after using magic. However, Ryan approached her and asked her to calm down, saying that she was putting too much pressure on herself. But anyway, after covering her up, he asked her to do nothing today and just rest. The girl wanted to object, but the guy at that moment said that he would make her a strawberry sandwich. Ashtart immediately smiled and said that in that case she would rest. The boy smiled at her and said that it was definitely a great idea, but just before he left, the girl stopped him. Aelion asked in surprise what had happened, because for some unknown reason the girl had grabbed him by the sleeve. The girl, looking at him, asked if he could stay with her a little longer. She started promising him that she wouldn't bother him, and that it would only be for 5 minutes, yes, or at least for a minute. She apologized for her stubbornness and rudeness, but still, it was her wish. The guy at that moment said that everything was fine, and if she wanted, he would stay until she fell asleep, but still. He wondered who had told her that asking him to stay with her was a stubborn act. However, at that moment, our heroine definitely felt the feeling that Ryan was very similar to Leona when she was angry. Our heroine couldn't even remember the last time Ryan was so angry. She suddenly remembered him asking what milk she liked best, but even then he hadn't been this angry. So she thought of something else when he said that she didn't think highly enough of herself. The girl assumed he was worried about her just like he had been then. Anyway, she said that it wasn't like that at all. Ashtart admitted that she was simply very scared, so she said so. She has never been so stubborn and willful, even with the only person who loves her. Ryan asked in confusion if she was afraid that everyone would hate her. The girl replied that even her family did not love her, so she was afraid that he would simply leave her. However, looking at the girl, he understood that the only one of them who would leave was she. The guy at this point turned to Ashtart and suggested that living here wasn't that bad. He was leading up to the point that he wanted to say that she could stay here longer. And yet, he sighed heavily, saying that it would be unfair to Lowina, who was waiting for her. The girl sighed at that moment and said that this was indeed the case, so she needed to go back. The man she worried about so much at night that it kept her awake. This person was Lowina, and she often wondered why it wasn't one of her family members. If only she had a chance to go back and fulfill her dream, that is what she prayed for until her last breath in her past life. The girl looked at her hand and said that she wanted to be loved by everyone for a long time, and she didn't think it was wrong. Aelion took her hand and said that she certainly had the right to wish for it, but still, she could not force everyone in this world to love her. That's why he said she shouldn't love everyone. At that moment, he put something in her hand. Aelion handed her a lily-of-the-valley hairpin and told her that she already had someone who loved her. At that moment, the girl screamed in bewilderment, saying that she was incredibly happy to see her hairpin. Nevertheless, the guy began to apologize and say that he did not hide it on purpose, or rather he knew that he could not. But instead of screaming or being offended, the girl ran up to him and hugged him, starting to thank him. The girl began to cry, continuing to thank Ryan for finding her hairpin. Aelion knew he felt sorry for her and thought it would be better for her to stay with him. Still, he was selfish and it was frustrating, but he couldn't keep her here against her will any longer. But he still knew he didn't want to be the reason someone had trouble again. He turned to Ashtart and told her that she didn't have to try so hard to be loved, because in his eyes she was more than deserving of love. And yet thanks to these thoughts he understood that he had to let her go to the man who was really waiting for her return. After some time the girl was finally able to fall asleep, and Ryan made sure of it. Soon the boy began to carry the book of magic, suggesting that it would be better for the two of them if they could meet a little earlier. Still, he was shocked at how quickly she learned to use magic. He didn't know if it was talent or if the girl simply had such a strong desire. Either way, Ryan knew it was too late for him, but she still had a chance. The funny thing was, he had never believed in fate until this moment, but now he really hoped that their meeting wasn't a coincidence. Anyway, he left this book for her, but he hoped that she would find it as late as possible. After a while, our heroine woke up, although her body felt heavy. She decided that she had simply been pushing herself too hard, as Ryan had said. By the way, he said that if the spell is not finished or interrupted, it is very exhausting for the magician who used the spell. And yet she thought she knew a lot thanks to the Book of Magic. But in reality, Ryan definitely knew more. At that moment, the girl realized that when Ryan held her, she felt as if the magic had been torn apart. Ashtart suddenly thought that he might have stopped her on purpose so that she couldn't return home. The girl started laughing at that moment because she assumed that she was thinking about some nonsense. She began to put on the hair clip, realizing that Ryan would never do something like that because he always helped her for free. It didn't seem like there was any benefit to him from her being here, but then what reason would he have to hold on to her? One way or another, the next thing the girl thought about was where Ryan had gone, since he wasn't even in the next room. She knew that he usually sat in the next room, or sometimes came to her with food. Something was wrong that day, but her thoughts were interrupted when the girl noticed His Highness's book right in front of her. The girl knew for sure that at such a low height, she could reach it without any problems. At that very moment, the girl began to reach for the book, hoping to get it, and she had very little left. But nevertheless, soon she simply fell to the ground, realizing that she could not reach, but what to do now? Ashtart immediately remembered that she had once already looked for a way in a book to return home. But at the same time, she learned several other useful spells. The girl smiled, suggesting that she should try out her new knowledge. After just a few moments, the book literally jumped out of its place and fell into Ashtart's hands. The girl shook herself and decided that she should be careful, otherwise she could get hurt. There was no way she could ruin the book, because she would still have to give it back, otherwise His Highness would be very angry with her. And yet, if she could return, the girl decided that she would first need to return the book to her brother and apologize. She needed to be brave and just talk. The action moves to the Florence Palace. On this day, even a dark cloud hangs over the building, symbolizing the problem. The prince shouted in bewilderment and asked Ashen how long he was going to keep apologizing since time was passing and his reports were not changing. The guy sighed heavily and apologized, saying that they were doing everything they could. He informed that they had begun to inspect the lily garden where the princess was last seen, and even if magic had been used, they would have come across traces, but Miragein, holding his head, interrupted the captain of the guard and said that he knew without him that they had found nothing. The guy assumed that they had made no progress since yesterday, but then what was the point of their efforts if they hadn't learned anything new? He said the longer they tried to find Ashtart, the more likely it was that her disappearance would become known. The prince knew they couldn't allow this to happen. It would be problematic if people found out he was looking for someone who was an outcast from the entire empire. Turning his gaze, the boy said that he would give one more order, and as always, he hoped that Ashen would be reasonable. After some time, Noah opened the door to the office, saying that he heard that they were looking for him. Miragein quickly invited his brother inside and told him to sit at the table with him. Noah immediately assumed his brother wanted him to do something. Miragein laughed, saying he liked how quick he was at catching on. The boy said he wanted Noah to do something without anyone knowing. The prince suggested that there was someone who needed to be taken care of. However, Miragein said that this was not the case because he needed him to find someone. At that moment, the guy took the sugar and was about to throw it into the tea while asking who he should find. Soon, his brother's voice echoed in his head, telling him to find Ashtart. The prince said that she was missing and that they had searched the entire empire but found no sign of her presence. That's why he was turning to his brother Noah, in turn reminded him in bewilderment that he had always tried to stay away from her. Miragein at that moment answered him that he no longer thought so, and if Ashtart did not mind, he intended to communicate with her more closely. However, Noah reminded them that there was a priest who would not allow them to do this. Miragein replied that he knew this, which is why he was asking his brother for help. After all, Noah always obeyed his orders, but would he disobey this time? And yet at that moment, the boy put down his spoon and said that he would do everything in his power. By the way, Noah's behavior is justified by his childhood in which the Empress told him to listen to his older brother and do everything he says. At that moment, the guy began to rise from his chair, getting ready to go to the exit, but Miragein stopped him. The boy asked his brother about the robe he always wore. He was curious why he hadn't seen it for a long time. Noah hesitated a little at this point, but still said that the robe had become dirty, and so he threw it away. And again he headed for the exit, but at that moment the prince asked in surprise whether he had by any chance given this robe to Ashtart. The boy approached his brother and asked him to tell him why he did it. Noah just stared coldly at the door and asked if that was an order. However, Miragein replied that he was just curious. And yet at that moment, the guy reached for the door handle, which surprised Miragein. The boy smiled before leaving and told his brother that even if this question were an order, he still would not answer it. Soon after these words, the boy left his brother's room and left Miragein alone with his thoughts. Anyway, in the meantime, it was gradually getting dark, and the action takes us to the Empress's palace. At this time, as every day, Ashen was heading here for one single reason. Having already approached the door, she reached out to knock, but she didn't even have to knock because the door was opened by Lowina, who was exhausted. After a while, they were inside. The knight asked in surprise if she had really been waiting for him. Lowina replied that she just happened to see him coming from the window, and that's why she opened the door for him so quickly. Ashen asked the girl in surprise if this was really true, but he himself knew that she could not lie. And the tea was at the perfect temperature and age. It was impossible to prepare it in a hurry. That is why anyone would have noticed that a lot of effort had gone into the preparation. Raising his head, he looked at Lowina, assuming that she had lost even more weight. Does she even eat? At that moment, he approached the maid and, pointing to a chair, said that she should sit down. As soon as they settled down, the guy suddenly started talking about the whereabouts of Princess Ashtart. The girl interrupted him at this point and assumed that he was going to say that they were doing everything they could, but again, they could not find her. Lowina told him that he certainly shouldn't come here every time for these words, and frankly speaking, it was too painful for her to wait every day to have her hopes dashed again. But soon after he comes, she feels a sense of complete disappointment inside her. However, the guy shouted and said that this time everything could be different because he received an order from the Crown Prince, and they also turned to Noah for help. The girl initially did not understand who he was talking about, but assumed that he was talking about the second prince. The guy nodded his head and said that if they both got involved, they would definitely be able to find the princess. That is why, looking at the maid, he asked her not to worry because everything will be fine. However, in turn, the maid began to laugh and ask Ashen if he knew the value of something expensive. The guy looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant. Lowina began to say that the value of expensive things is difficult to determine if they are too close. The girl was sure that many people understand the value of something that they always had at hand only when they lose it. This is exactly what the Crown Prince felt now, and the girl could not understand whether it made her happy or upset. However, at this point, Ashen said that even if a person really understood the value of a thing, what would change? Lowina looked at him and said that it was obvious the whole world would change. The guy started saying that the world doesn't change that easily, to which the maid replied that it wasn't about the world itself, but about how they saw it. She knew at firsthand how powerful the changes could be. At that moment, Ashen said he didn't quite understand her. In turn, the girl said that even if she tried to tell him more, she did not think she would be able to convey her thoughts correctly. Ashen at this time understood that the girl was speaking calmly, but the more he listened, the more he remembered something. It was all similar to how she spoke to the Crown Prince. Of course, she was not as brave now as she was when she was angry, and yet the girl continued that if it were possible, then she would not regret it so much. The guy still didn't understand what was going on. Could he have been wrong all this time since Leona seemed so confident and optimistic? Lowina suddenly said something that seemed too late for her, but she hoped that he would be able to find it. Ashen was shocked that all this time she was tormented by heavy and sad thoughts, and the girl looked at him and said that she hoped that he would find someone who would be dear to him. The guy asked her again in bewilderment because he only had to look at her to be horrified. After losing the princess, the girl simply lost herself and no longer saw the meaning in life. What is the point in loving a person so much? And yet the guy knew for sure that he did not need the people dear to him, neither now nor in the future. At this time, Lowina looked out the window and looked at the street with disappointment. Everything led to the fact that she even began to see things that weren't really there because she saw a princess in front of her. Continuing to look out the window, she began to address the princess, calling her name. After that, her laughter began to be heard, which was rather crazy. Ashen was sad to watch what was happening. Looking at this, he did not understand at all what kind of strange man was standing in front of him. The guy was perplexed because she should at least be crying loudly instead of looking out the window with a pitiful look. Soon the action takes us to our heroine who was trying to cast a spell and return home. However, absolutely nothing happened, causing the confused girl to fall to the ground wondering why the spell didn't work. She was absolutely sure that she had read everything correctly, but in that case, did something happen to her power? By the way, Ryan set a limit of 50 spells per day because she didn't have enough magic. At this moment, our heroine was seriously scared because she decided that all her mana had simply run out. In shock, she began to wonder if she had used up the last of her magic when she took out the book. Anyway, the action shifts to Aelion, who was walking down the hallway and asking where the guest was. Kylo told him that he was waiting in the living room. After some time, the guy went inside the office and noticed a guy with red hair there. The boy greeted his lordship, but Aelion immediately reminded him that he had told him not to come here. The prince of the Nohai's empire. Joshua Nohais began to say that if he had not come, it was unknown when he would have been able to meet him again. The guy showed with his whole appearance how sorry he was and how much he wanted to come here. Aelion laughed to himself at that moment because Joshua's sincerity sometimes reminded him of a puppy. However, at that moment, the prince looked at Aelion's shackles and assumed that he was uncomfortable. The boy replied that if he was talking about the shackles from the emperor, then he was already used to them. At that moment, the guy sighed heavily and said that he didn't even know what to tell him. Soon, they were sitting over a cup of tea and discussing their issues. Joshua said that it had been 2 years since that incident. And still, the guy said that his decision remained the same. He promised to free him one day. Looking at the executioner, Elforman, the prince said that he would cleanse him of this shameful title. The guy sighed heavily and said that actually his name used to be different. Jolly Elforman. The Elforman clan, by the way, is one of the three main families of the Nohays Empire, and this was the nickname given to Aelion Elforman, the heir of the family. At first, many people treated the smiling and cheerful Aelion well, but the truth was that Aelion had one gift, and it was a special but dangerous ability. One night, a terrible situation occurred that caused his brother Ian to lose his leg. Aelion watched for a long time and blamed himself for what happened to his brother. However, all this happened because he wanted to show his hidden power. A little Aelion could not even think that his power could threaten the emperor. The head of the family turned to his son and asked him to promise that no matter what happened, he should not use his power. Although it was an accident that he could not foresee, he was tormented by guilt. The guy began to hide not only his abilities, but also began to avoid all people. Only one maid came and told him who wanted to see him, and in response to this, the guy asked to say that he would be in his room. And yet none of the family members blamed him, and this kindness only made Aelion feel worse. It would have been easier for him if they had simply hated him. The guy understood that he was scared that even if they didn't say anything now, he was afraid that he would see indignation in their eyes when they met. He thought that a creature like him should live locked up because he was born with a terrible cursed power. Even after a year, the situation remained unchanged, at least until Emperor Nohays called him. Of course, this invitation could not be cancelled. So soon they were near the Imperial palace, and the father was addressing Ryon. The man said that no matter what His Majesty said, he should not doubt it. No matter what he did, Aelion still shouldn't have used his power, and the boy himself understood this perfectly well standing in front of the palace. And yet after some time they went inside and went deeper. Father suddenly suggested that he knew why there were so many complaints about the current imperial government, because it was difficult to look at all that glittering gold in the palace. Passing by a huge portrait of the emperor, the father asked his son what the crown prince would be like. After all, he was going to be the next emperor. The guy just said that he hoped he would be a good emperor. He had to be a fair ruler who wasn't bound by his position. The father nodded his head and told his son that he thought absolutely right. After some time, they were in the throne room and bowed their knees because it was an honor for them to greet the great golden dragon Nohays, the emperor of the Nohays Empire. Albert Nohays told the boys that they did not need such formalities, and it was better to just raise their heads. The man stood up and thanked His Majesty for the invitation, but the emperor said that there was no need to thank him. He assumed they were surprised by his sudden summons, and he was grateful that they had come here so quickly. Aelion at this moment looked at the emperor's fake smile and couldn't understand what was happening to the atmosphere. It seemed that something was wrong here. Soon the emperor came closer and said that there was only one reason why he had called them. It consists in the fact that he recently heard something rather interesting. At this point, Aelion was truly scared because he didn't understand what was happening and where it was all heading. The man said that the story he heard surprised him greatly because it was about the funny guy Elforman. House Elforman existed before the current emperor ascended to the throne, and even among the nobility they wielded great power. And because the emperor and the prince were constantly compared to the Elforman heir, the Imperial family was very unhappy. Everyone knows that they consider them an eyesore. And yet Aelion continued to sit on his knee and repeated to himself that he must not shake. It was only at this moment that the emperor leaned towards him and said that he wanted to check something with the help of Lord Aelion Elforman. The man asked him if it was true that he could read Wayrak and could use destruction magic. The guy was perplexed because he didn't understand how the emperor knew about this because he never used it again. Anyway, Albert asked the guy in surprise why he couldn't just answer him. If it wasn't true, he could just say so. And still, if he behaved in this way, then he could only suspect something was wrong. Aelion was puzzled because the Pope tried so hard to keep it a secret. Then why? And if the emperor already knew everything, then there was no point in denying all this. At this point, the empire's crown prince William Nohays intervened and told his father that this was unlikely. If this were true, would House Elforman have been hiding such an ability all this time? The emperor thought about it and decided that this was also true because the noble house of Elforman would not try to start a rebellion using a merry fellow. At this point, Aelion's father began to tell the Emperor that his son was an ordinary man. After that, he turned his head and looked at his son, Aelion, immediately read in his eyes the very words he had said before entering. However, a moment later, the Emperor plunged his sword into the man's leg. Aelion screamed in confusion and asked the Emperor what he was doing, but the man told the boy not to move, otherwise he would cut off the entire leg. He told him to show strength if he wanted to save his father. However, the boy said he knew nothing about it, and the Emperor suddenly asked if that would change his answer. At that moment, Aelion's mother and brother entered the room. The boy did not understand what they were doing there and why. However, at this point, William began to use magic, suggesting that the boy needed more motivation. At that very moment, a machine appeared above my brother and mother, which in the blink of an eye ended their lives. Aelion looked around and tried to understand why and for what purpose they were doing all this. Was it really just to check if he had magic that could kill people? At that moment, the Emperor swung his blade and asked the boy if he would allow his father to die. After all, now was the only chance to save him. By the way, all this time Joshua was sitting behind the throne, shaking with fear. And again, the guy began to blame himself for everything, thinking that it would have been better for him not to have been born at all. However, at that very moment, the boy decided that if the Emperor wanted to see it, he would show it to them. Akvestrion. The boy cast a spell, and soon after something that could destroy the Emperor and the Crown Prince loomed over them. The Emperor was incredibly amazed by this power and immediately began to think about what he could do with it. In turn, Aelion repeated over and over again the words that wanted to destroy the Emperor and his son. The Emperor was on the verge of death at this time, but he still assumed that with this power he could conquer the entire continent. And yet, at that very moment, the magic stopped, because a voice was heard from behind Aelion. Turning his head, he saw his father, who reminded him that his power was not for killing people, and he must remember his promise. Before his death, the man asked his son not to die and to stay alive, because the ideal of the Emperor that he spoke about. He wanted to see this Emperor rule no highs. At that moment, tears began to flow. The boy began to reach out to his father, and his father only told him not to cry because it was not his fault. Soon the man fell to the ground and said nothing, but Aelion continued to scream, asking him to get up. He asked his mother and brother not to leave him alone. He hadn't even earned their forgiveness yet. So what was he supposed to do now? Apparently this was Albert's plan all along. In exchange for his family not being considered traitors, the merry Elforman was falsely accused of murdering his family. The Elforman executioner. It was a disgrace he had accepted in order to stay alive and fulfill his father's dying wish. Well, Joshua knew about these nicknames anyway. The boy reminded the prince of how he had watched everything that was happening around him. However, at that moment, the guy just looked down, realizing all his guilt. Aelion was lost in his thoughts at this point as the boy asked him if he was really going to follow the Emperor's will. And yet how stupid it was. Aelion could not understand what the point was in living according to the will of the Emperor. Looking at his shackles, he knew that it was simply not time yet. This was something he had been thinking about for a long time. And yet on his way, he met one amazing girl who changed his thinking. The boy at this point turned to the prince and asked him what he thought a good emperor did. Joshua thought for a moment and said that an emperor must be just a ruler who is not constrained by his position. He thought that the lands needed someone who could bring peace and lead the entire nation. At this point, Aelion froze in shock as he tried to comprehend what he had just heard. These words were painfully familiar because these were the same words his father had said to him when he said goodbye. Soon Aelion said that they had a coincidence because he thinks exactly the same. That's why the guy said he wasn't going to live in the shadows anymore. However, at that moment, there was a noise. Joshua at that moment jumped up from his seat and turning to his lordship asked what had just happened. The guy immediately asked Aelion if he had another guest by any chance. Aelion replied that there was no one and most likely it was just something that fell. However, he felt that the magical aura was weakening. The guy thought, had she managed to return safely? By the way, as far as he understood, the escaped maid sold information that he could control destructive magic. She made a deal with a masked man who introduced himself as an Imperial mage. This information was then passed on to the Emperor. These damned Imperial mages were disgusting, but nevertheless, the guy did not sleep, realizing one thing. He could still feel the magic, so he immediately began to assume that it was someone sent by Albert. However, the unwelcome guest was not the Imperial mage, but a frightened girl. Even though she could cause trouble, he began to worry about her. In her, he seemed to see himself, the lonely child from the past. Maybe that was why next to her he felt that he was no longer alone. And even in the midst of this nightmare in which it was scary to even breathe, he began to see the light, although he was sure that she had already returned. And yet he knew for sure that he was not going to part with her forever. Just at that moment, our heroine finally managed to use magic, and soon it disappeared. In turn, Aelion knew that if she could not stay here, then he would go and find Ashtart. At this point, Joshua approached the guy and said that he would like to talk to him about the current emperor, but Aelion thought that Ashtart had called their meeting fate, which meant that if it existed, they would definitely meet again. The action moves to our heroine, who with incredible luck was still able to return back. She thought about it and assumed that she hadn't been able to return before simply because she lacked concentration. Anyway, at that moment she decided to look around to see where she was because it didn't look like the Empress's castle. Our heroine knew for sure that she had never been here before, but she assumed that Lowina was somewhere nearby. After all, this spell was supposed to take her to the one who missed her. The girl simply couldn't understand why the maid was sleeping here. She was sure that Lowina was the only one who would look for her, but at that moment, someone grabbed her hand. The Emperor of the Firenze Empire, Orvan Firenze, asked the girl in bewilderment who she was. At that moment, our heroine noticed the green eyes and realized that they were the same color as the prince and princess. The girl decided that this was obviously an inherited color, and that could only mean one thing. However, at that moment something happened that the girl could not have expected. The man asked her in surprise if it was Rebecca. Our heroine did not understand what was happening, and the man continued to talk in bewilderment about how she had simply abandoned and left him. Had she really come back just to mock him now? Soon Orvan lowered his eyes downwards. In turn, Ashtart took her hand back in bewilderment and told the Emperor that she did not know what he was talking about. Soon after, the girl said that Rebecca was dead and had been for a very long time. Ashtart was outraged that she was compared to her mother, but the girl said that she is not her mother. She knew the name of her mother, who had died in childbirth 10 years ago, the second Empress of Florence. But who was this person? Anyway, at that moment, the man, perplexed, began to come closer and closer and assumed that Ashtart was standing in front of him. The girl was shocked. How did he know her name? And yet he continued to approach, and our heroine continued to move away, realizing that she had to leave right now. At that very moment, our heroine screamed and used a spell. Instantly, all the dust flew into the air because it was wind magic, which was very effective. However, the man did not understand what was happening, so he immediately grabbed his sword. As soon as the girl noticed that this madman wielded a sword, she knew she couldn't get caught. The man in turn asked in bewilderment whether she was really trying to escape from him, and at that moment, our heroine finally saw a portal in which she clearly saw Lowina, who was sitting in her room. However, at that moment, the man threw his sword to the ground and turned to Ashtart. The man began to reach out to her, asking her to wait a little because she had misunderstood everything. However, the girl was so scared that she took a step forward without thinking. At this time, the extremely desperate Lowina was sitting in the room, no longer knowing what to believe. But at that very moment, something incredible happened, and she saw a princess in front of her. The girl raised her head in bewilderment, and looking at Ashtart, asked if it was really her. She raised her hand and reached out to the princess, assuming that it was all a dream, but our heroine continued to repeat her name. The girl looked at the maid in bewilderment and asked if she would prefer that she be a dream. Lowina instantly jumped up from her seat and hugged the princess as tightly as she could. The girl asked if she knew how hard she had been looking for her. She was incredibly afraid that something had happened to her. Our heroine was very upset because she saw how much weight Lowina had lost because of her. The girl asked her to stop crying because it was her fault. The girl cried loudly and asked not to leave her here alone anymore. Our heroine looked at her with tears in her eyes and asked how she could do this, because she never wanted to leave her because she was the only one she wanted to return to. That is why our heroine knew for sure that she would always return to where she belongs. Soon, the action moves to the table. The girl, perplexed, asked if the reason she disappeared from the garden was because she used magic. The girl calmly drank her favorite milk and nodded her head without being particularly distracted, making it clear that everything was correct. But the milk, by the way, was very sweet, and especially when prepared by Lowina, it was always excellent. Although at that moment she thought about it because the sandwiches that Ryan fed her were also delicious. However, Lowina at that moment said in bewilderment that it was impossible because she had never heard the ancient language before. It would take a lifetime to master even one. This is why princes who master the language at a young age are called geniuses. Only our heroine said in response to this that she too could not believe it at first, but nevertheless it was true. She looked at Lowina in surprise and asked what was the point of her lying about what she had said. And yet she thought that members of the royal family bearing the name Ferenzi had amazing abilities. They could read one or more ancient languages. The girl was shocked because it turned out that the princes turned out like this, but now it was the princess's turn. At this point, Lowina turned to the princess and asked her to promise her one thing. The maid asked the princess not to tell anyone else about this except her. She explained that the girl must keep the fact that she could safely use magic a secret. Ashtart at that moment remembered the words of Ryan, who also gave her advice to keep her abilities a secret from others. The girl was upset at that moment because she realized that she hadn't really had time to say goodbye to him. When would they see each other again? She thought about thanking him, but she immediately talked herself out of it, thinking that she wasn't using magic anymore. She might not be able to come back next time. All this time, Lowina held the little finger and asked in surprise if the princess really didn't want to give her a promise. Our heroine immediately said that it wasn't so. And yet, looking at the maid's hand, she asked what she was doing, and Lowina replied that it was a pinky promise. When she makes a promise, you need to clasp your little fingers together, and thus, you cannot break the promise. Soon the girl did as Lowina showed her and said that she really wouldn't tell anyone. Lowina at this point said that if she broke her promise, she would no longer make her sweet milk. Our heroine was horrified by such conditions. She decided that it was too cruel, and Lowina just said that this promise was so important, but still, if she keeps this promise, she will prepare milk much more often. The girl immediately proudly declared that she would do everything to keep her promise. She had to hold on for the milk. At this time, the action moves to the palace, and the guy, perplexed, asks His Highness if he is really going to the Empress's palace. Miragein replied that he had heard that Princess Ashtart had returned, so he needed to check it out for himself. The boy asked in surprise why he was doing this after not visiting for 10 years. The prince replied that he felt guilty towards the child. Miragein's assistant, Kal Bermuz, said that if he was not feeling well, then it was even more unwise to go. He should have warned him when the prince was wrong, and he apologized for his impudence, but as a devoted servant, he begged him to give up the idea. Kale wondered what could possibly change after so many years. If he suddenly showed up, would the girl really be grateful to him? He assured him that the princess already had people who had replaced her family, and they were already much closer than he was. And what's more, Kale started screaming, although he certainly didn't want to do it, but still he shouldn't approach her. He argued that the prince's actions would only cause confusion, but the boy continued to walk straight. Miragein at this point asked how he could get that right back. Kale, surprised, asked what he meant. Miragein replied that the assistant said that it was too late and nothing would change, but would anything change if he just sat on the sidelines and did nothing? Kale only realized in horror that he had ruined everything, and the prince was not listening to him at all. The guy now began to talk about what the high priest might find out. After all, the priest of Horium has the faith of the people of Ferenzi, and if the crown prince does not listen to him, it will only mean that the priest can say that the royal family is leading Ferenzi to destruction. The light will bring endless honor and prosperity to Ferenzi. And everyone also knows that darkness in turn will swallow up the light and lead the empire to destruction. The guy scratched his head with a heavy sigh, realizing that he had no personal claims against Princess Ashtart, but this was a problem. However, at that moment, a voice came from behind him asking if he should go too. The guy turned around and noticed Prince Noah in front of him, which made him even more shocked. Kale was obviously surprised and wondered since when Noah was here. Miragein asked his brother in surprise if he was really going to go. However, Ashen followed Noah and said that he was coming too. Kale soon realized that no one was listening to him, so he eventually decided to follow them. But he was still wondering what was going on here. At this point, the maid turned to the princess and asked if she really wanted to stay in these clothes. The girl smiled and nodded her head. Lowina told her that she would most likely catch a cold because it was cold outside, but the girl said that she wanted to keep the dresses she had given her. And of course, the girl restrained herself from admitting that it was a gift from the Crown Prince. With a heavy sigh, the maid handed her a mug of sweet milk, asking her to warm herself up at least like that. Of course, the girl happily took it and began to drink. Lowina laughed and asked if she really liked it that much. The girl replied that it was even better than strawberry sandwiches. Lowina was surprised at this point because she didn't understand what strawberry sandwiches were being talked about. Had she ever made them? Of course, our heroine told the whole story. The maid immediately decided that the guy named Ryan helped her. The girl replied that he sheltered her and then helped her return. The girl was very surprised by this because the guy helped even after he saw the color of the princess's hair, and yet she is very grateful. Also, at this moment, our heroine said that Ryan told her that her name is the name of an ancient goddess. Ashtart turned to the maid and asked her if she knew who gave her name. With a heavy sigh, the girl said that of course she knew the reason and who said it. It was obvious because her mother, the temporary Empress Rebecca, named her that. They said that she met the gods in a dream. Ashtart asked in surprise if her mother really dreamed of the gods. However, gods never appeared in people's dreams, only if they were people with divine abilities. Lowina said that it was all true because the Empress was a candidate for the High Priestess, and she knew Sensiberian. Our heroine was shocked. And yet the gods from the dream told the girl that they heard her dream of a child. They promised to give her a child with strong divine abilities. That is why they said that this baby would be given the name Ashtart. They ordered to take good care of the child. That morning when the Empress woke up, she joyfully pronounced the name of her child Ashtarte. However, our heroine had never seen her mother and missed her. She couldn't describe it exactly, but Lowina's story seemed so real to her as if she herself had been there. Only at that moment, a very interesting question appeared in her head. Didn't Lowina come to the palace after she was born? Our heroine decided to ask the maid directly about this issue, and so she asked how she knew this story so well. The girl just wanted to say something, but at that moment there was a knock at the door. She was surprised because she certainly wasn't expecting guests. Opening the door, Lowina found Ashen. The girl immediately assumed that he had come here to see the princess. At that very moment, the crown prince stepped onto the threshold and said that she was absolutely right. He then asked where Princess Ashtart was. The girl, perplexed, began to turn to His Highness and tell him to wait because he couldn't just come in. The girl also looked ahead and noticed the puzzled Prince Noah. What are they all doing here? She looked at Ashen, realizing that this was partly his doing. The girl could not contain her anger. However, Lowina reminded what she said last time. The Empress's palace has restrictions for the Imperial family, is she right? At that moment, Kale ran up perplexed, asking what last time meant. The boy asked Miragein in confusion if this wasn't his first visit. The prince just told him to shut up. Miragein turned his head again and asked where Ashtart was now. Soon he looked up and discovered a girl peeking around the corner. The prince immediately noticed that the girl was wearing the same strange clothes as the previous times. He still couldn't understand why she didn't wear the dresses he gave her. The prince soon apologized for such an unexpected visit, but it was necessary because he heard that she was missing. The main reason for the visit was that he wanted to know where she had been all this time. Soon there was complete silence in the room as everyone waited for the princess to tell her story. In turn, our heroine was in shock because it was too uncomfortable. She had never had so many eyes looking at her at the same time. At this point, Noah said that since they heard the news of her disappearance, they had been looking for her everywhere. He would be interested to know where she had been. Our heroine suggested that to some extent she was waiting and hoping that her family would come and take her away. And now they were all sitting in the room right in front of her, which was very ambiguous. Ashtart assumed that she should be happier now than ever. But the girl still couldn't understand why she didn't feel anything right now. Even Prince Miragein, looking at the girl, noticed that her gaze was no longer the same as before. Our heroine at that moment sat with a sad face and tried to sort herself out when suddenly one thought appeared. She remembered Ryan's words telling her that not everyone in the world would like her, so she shouldn't love everyone. Ryan had said these words to her, and she knew that perhaps she should have listened to him. However, at that moment, Leona turned to the girl who, to Ashtart's horror, was bleeding from the mouth. At that moment, the girl remembered how she had clenched her teeth with anger when she thought about the prince, that something unpleasant had happened. The girl explained that she seemed to have split her lip. Lowina, however, tried to remain calm. However, the girl leaned over and asked if she still remembered the promise, because she had promised not to tell anyone, and this also applied to the princes. Our heroine smiled and asked her not to worry because she wouldn't tell anyone. Soon the girl stated that in fact she herself did not know what had happened. She lost consciousness on the way back, but when she opened her eyes, she miraculously found herself here. The prince asked in bewilderment what she meant by miraculously ending up here. Ashtart immediately panicked, thinking that the prince had already guessed everything. Our heroine felt very guilty inside because she didn't know how to lie. Noah at this point was confused and said that it made no sense, so he wondered how she could be so calm. The guy asked her what she would do if something like this happened again. Ashtart knew for sure that he had guessed, but why was he angry? The prince continued to ask how she could know for sure that she would wake up next time since she could have died. He looked straight into her eyes and asked if she was afraid of what might happen. In turn, our heroine was absolutely calm because she made it all up herself. With a heavy sigh, the guy said that if Ashtart, whom they had been looking for so long, was okay, then he was coming back. He immediately got up from the sofa and headed towards the exit, wishing everyone a good day. At that moment, only the prince understood that his brother was not the kind of person who would express his feelings so openly. That's why he wondered what kind of performance this was all about. Kale never thought he'd see Noah worried, but he was actually unexpectedly glad about it. In any case, he turned to His Highness and reminded him that he had been away from the palace for too long. He had checked that the princess was okay, so it was time to return. All Kale knew was that the longer they were here, the greater the chance the high priest would find out. If he could just escort the crown prince back, that would be great. However, at that very moment, the guy got up from the sofa and turned to the girl. Kale was happy at this moment because he assumed that the prince was finally leaving, but the boy looked at the little girl in bewilderment and asked if she knew who he was. With a heavy sigh, our heroine lowered her head and said that he was the crown prince. Miragein suddenly asked the question differently. He asked her if she knew what their relationship was to each other. Our heroine was equally reluctant to assume that they were a family related by blood. The guy said that she was right, and at the same time as a family member, how should she call him? At that moment, Ashtart was shocked. She immediately thought of her brother, but these thoughts brought her to terrible memories. She remembered how the prince had told her not to call him that because she had to watch how she behaved. The girl was incredibly scared and began to assume that now he was simply trying to test her and warn her like last time. That's why she said she should call him Crown Prince. He asked to call him that. Miragein at this point looked down and said that it was true. He really said it. Our heroine was surprised by his reaction, not understanding. Wasn't this the answer he wanted to hear? She thought he would be happy, but on the contrary, he looked upset. In turn, the crown prince only remembered the words of the maid who told him that time could not be turned back. At that moment when Ashtart said those words, it was as if a lump had risen in his throat, preventing him from speaking. The guy immediately turned to Kale and said that he was coming back. His advisor was only incredibly happy about this. He asked to leave the palace immediately. After some time, the guy was walking down the street remembering this meeting, and he was disappointed. There was absolutely nothing in Ashtart's eyes when she looked at him. He saw no emotion. Remembering her words in which she quoted his vile and stupid requests, the prince only felt worse. Ashen and Kale at this point turned to His Highness in bewilderment, assuming that he was ill. They even suggested that he call a doctor, but the prince thought that everything would be fine as soon as she returned. Whatever he did, he only became convinced that this pain would never go away. At this time, the action moves to the great temple of Asmodeus, from which loud laughter was heard. We observed a woman in a headscarf walking through the temple. It is a place where a dark aura reigns even in the light of day. There was no reason to stay here. As soon as the woman came in, she said she had something to tell. The man who was praying near the temple asked in surprise what she had come to tell him. The woman said that according to her information, the princes left the palace and were absent for a long time. The high priest Horium looked at his assistant in bewilderment and asked if he understood correctly that they had finally reached the Empress's palace. The girl nodded her head and said that the princes had indeed visited the Empress's palace. The woman asked the high priest what he was going to do now. The man simply asked in surprise why she was nervous and said that there was nothing here that she should worry about. He reminded her that she told him that they needed to isolate the Dark Star and protect Firenze. The girl began to say that nothing had changed her intention to protect the land she was born on, but watching the princes, she began to worry. At this moment, the high priest looked at the girl in bewilderment and asked if she was really afraid that the crown prince would find her. After all, he would then find out that it was she who had cut the funds for financing the Empress's palace to a ridiculous amount. But she had been doing this for quite a long period of time. Looking at the woman, he laughed, assuming that she was living well. At that moment, he pulled the scarf off her, and turning to the headmaid, asked if he was thinking correctly. Anyway, the woman said that all the evidence was in the accounting book. The man waved his hand and said that he would handle it, so he asked her not to worry and returned to the palace. The headmaid was confident that he wouldn't let her down, so, even though she was worried, she had to trust him. However, at this moment, the man turned to the woman and asked how Princess Amaryllis was doing at this time. The woman nodded and said that everything was fine, but Horium told her to tell him if she noticed any suspicious changes. The headmaid soon said that she would do anything for the peace of Firenze. Soon, the priest was alone with his thoughts, and he realized that his plan was changing slightly. The man had his hand on forbidden alchemy and black magic. One way or another, he was so angry that he scattered all the books that surrounded him. The priest understood that Ashtart had lived quietly all this time, but why was she now trying to go out into the world? And yet, at that moment, he smiled because he remembered something interesting, or more precisely, that there should soon be a sacred festival. It's a big holiday, so they can raise Amaryllis's reputation this way. He thought about it and decided that if they did this, the problem would go away on its own. No matter what happened, the darkness could never beat the light. The action takes us to a week later. The emperor addresses the crown prince and says that it is not in his nature to behave so stupidly. Kale was horrified because he knew they were doomed, although he tried to control the rumors, but there were too many eyes in the palace and now they were caught by the emperor himself. The emperor asked Miragein if he had always been so reckless. He couldn't believe that he wanted to go to the empress's palace. Looking at his son, the father asked what could change his mind and lead him there. Since the prophecy was made, no one was allowed to enter the Empress's palace. However, the guy said that it says that she is the star of darkness that will cause the destruction of the empire. Kale tried his best to stop the prince because he couldn't say it so easily. It was as if he didn't know what the emperor did after hearing the prophecy. The action takes us back to the past when the man read these words. He said that darkness would swallow the light and lead the empire to destruction. Soon the emperor, perplexed, asked the high priest if he really meant that his child would destroy the empire. He immediately stood up and grabbed his sword, telling the man that his insolence knew no bounds. Seeing the priest say such offensive things and call it a prophecy, the emperor passed by him and said that it was becoming easy to judge the level of temples in the empire. That day the man left the high priest with a strange smile on his face. They say that after the emperor destroyed half of the temples of Florence, that is why Kale asked the prince in horror why he reminded the emperor of this. The guy suddenly said that he wanted to check, but seeing her in person, he could tell that she was an ordinary child, just like Riley. However, at that moment, the emperor jumped up and said that the incompetent assistant who did not stop the prince was to blame. He ordered Kale to be taken to the dungeon and taken into custody. Of course, this was all in Kale's imagination, who did not know what to do now. Only at that moment, the emperor became thoughtful, starting to talk about the child with beautiful golden eyes that shine brighter than any jewelry. Miragein was shocked and couldn't believe it. Had his father really met the princess? Anyway, at this point, the emperor said that there was something he wanted to know. The man looked at Miragein and asked if he really thought this child was normal. If the answer was positive, then the emperor was interested in the question. How could a completely ordinary girl enter his room in the middle of the night? And they heard it right. The emperor decided to ask them if they knew what had happened the night before they visited the empress's palace. He replied that the princess had simply appeared in his bedroom. She was a small and sweet, unexpected guest. This girl with shining eyes that shone even in the darkness stood in the middle of his room. And it was this little girl who called Rebecca Firenze her mother. However, shortly after that, she used magic he had never heard of before and simply disappeared before his eyes. Miragein began to analyze everything that his father had just said. The Empress Rebecca Ferenzi and her child is Ashtarte. It took the guy some time to realize that she had entered the main palace and what's more that she had used magic. Anyway, the Emperor added that the next day he was told that the princes had visited the Empress's palace. He stood up from his throne and asked the boys if they understood why he felt distrust. The Emperor looked into his son's eyes and ordered him to confess what they were hiding. One way or another, the action takes us back to the Empress's palace where Lowina was going to feed the girl. The girl asked Her Highness to guess what was for breakfast today. Soon after several incorrect guesses, the girl said that they would be eating beef stew. Ashtart was shocked because she couldn't believe that Lowina was so strong and amazing, but the girl said that it was just nothing to her. She began to pour food for the princess, who was perplexed by the fact that the pieces of meat there were simply huge. At this point, the girl turned to the princess and asked, "What about buns as dessert after breakfast?" The girl replied that she would be happy to eat them with milk. After Crown Prince Miragein and Prince Noah left, our heroes no longer suffered from lack of food. They no longer had to go to the Imperial Palace kitchen to beg for leftovers. Moreover, they were offered a large number of ingredients on behalf of the Crown Prince. Lowina almost burst into tears because her princess could finally fill her stomach to her heart's content. And yet she couldn't believe that the princes were suddenly trying to be nice after everything that had happened. She didn't even want to see them. At this moment, our heroine happily told the maid that she should eat with her because it was incredibly delicious. The girl began to smile, assuming that for now she could ignore various nonsense for the sake of the princess. After some time, the girl was worried about what would happen as soon as it became known that Prince Miragein was helping the Empress's palace. But still, they didn't even ask her anything, and yet before her disappearance, Ashtart was so waiting for her family to start paying attention to her. However, this had never happened before, and the way she behaved with the princes last time, quite coldly. Lowina had no idea what had happened to the princess she knew. However, at that moment the thoughts were interrupted because at that moment someone knocked on the door of the house. Only when she opened the door did she notice Sir Ashen on the threshold and was certainly a little surprised. After some time the guy told the news, but it was definitely not the most pleasant. The guy said that the Emperor invited the princess to the palace. Ashtart and Lowina were simply shocked by such news. At that moment, even the cookie fell from our heroine's hands because she began to shake. She had no doubts about the owner of the room she found herself in. He remembers that she mispronounced the spell, and the man managed to call out her mother's name as soon as he saw her. The girl was incredibly shocked and was only surprised that her father was an emperor. But still, I wondered why he wanted to see her. Maybe it was because she showed up in his room in the middle of the night. The girl began to imagine the worst scenarios and felt uneasy. But the maid pulled her out of her thoughts. Lowina looked at the princess and asked her in surprise if everything was okay. Our heroine raised her head and, looking at the maid, said that she did not want to go there. The first excuse that came up was that everyone would be looking at her, and the second excuse was that she might somehow offend His Majesty. It was for these two important reasons that the girl asked to be left at home and not taken anywhere. At this point, Lowina began to think that the girl had become so afraid of the outside world. In turn, Ashen was perplexed because it was all because he couldn't take the princess home. Suddenly, the guy turned to her and asked her not to worry. Our heroine assumed that she would be allowed not to go. Only the guy told her that if anyone crosses the line or looks at her disrespectfully, he will personally destroy everyone. Our heroine understood that there was a problem because this was not what she meant, and therefore a better excuse was needed. At that moment, our heroine began to scream in pain and bewilderment. The guys immediately jumped up and asked what happened. Ashtarta replied that she just had a stomachache. She was mentally apologizing to Lowina for making her worry anyway, but still, it hadn't been that long since she had returned to her, so she didn't want to die young like in her previous life. While the princess was doing her best to act out the pain, the maid said that she urgently needed to find medicine, but Ashen replied that he would bring everything. The girl said that the princess would not be able to meet the emperor in her current condition. Ashen nodded and said that he would convey this to the emperor. Our heroine was very glad that she was able to avoid meeting the emperor, and yet after some time, a set of all these medicines was brought to their house. Lowina was perplexed, saying that there was too much here that they would last for several years. Ashtart now felt like her stomach was hurting, but from excitement. Soon, another letter arrived in which His Majesty asked to have tea with him today. Our heroine was simply in incredible shock that even today he wanted to arrange something. Sir Ashen at this moment only calmly walked into the living room and put the letters on the table. Turning his head, the boy asked the girl what to tell him this time. And the situation was indeed unpleasant because the Emperor sent invitations 5 days in a row. Each girl found some lame excuse to refuse, but still. One day she caught a cold and didn't want to infect the Emperor, and one day she had a nosebleed, which is why she felt so bad. Soon she even said that she had a dream where she was told that if she left the house, she would break both her legs. In general, the excuses became more and more ridiculous. Each time Sir Ashen came to hear the answer from the girl and left with a disappointed face. Every time this happened, His Majesty sent her painkillers, cold medicine, hemostatic agents, and many other medications. One day, he even sent me rosemary tea, which helped with insomnia. Even Lowina at some point began to suggest that this would last for 5 years, so it was worth stopping supplies. Our heroine felt guilty because she had refused invitations so many times, and she thought that he would stop looking for her. However, he managed to pull the princess out of her thoughts. Ashen was finally able to reach her. The guy reminded her that he had to give a report today, so he needed an answer. Only then, our heroine suddenly started apologizing again and saying that she really didn't want to go today. After a short pause, the guy asked the princess in bewilderment if it was really only today that she didn't want to go outside. Looking at the girl, he asked if she could go tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Soon, he even got down on one knee and asked what he could do for her. He didn't know what he could do for the princess to get her out. Our heroine in turn was surprised and did not understand why Ashen was so fixated on this. However, the girl suddenly remembered her past life after she was sold to the Count. She was scolded daily. The action takes us back. The girl was addressing the princess and saying that the young master had just left. The girl was confused as to how he could skip class and just leave. She asked if it made any sense to her since they hadn't brought her here to allow such a thing. Our heroine was truly the only one who had to pay for the actions of others. That's why as a princess she could refuse. But what if Sir Ashen had to suffer every time because of her whims? That was the main thing that came to her mind. One way or another, the girl decided to ask if her refusal would cause problems for him. The guy sighed heavily and nodded his head, saying that this would bring problems for him, and very big ones. Our heroine was very upset because Sir Ashen had always been kind to her and she didn't want him to be scolded because of her. The girl sighed heavily but decided that she had to meet the Emperor. One way or another at this moment, the captain of the guard noticed that the girl's hands began to shake. The boy turned to her and asked her not to be afraid because he, Ashen Belga, swears on his knightly honor that he will protect her. Taking off his gloves, he extended his hand to our heroine, and she in turn began to examine it and saw countless calluses and scars. The girl immediately wondered, is Sir Ashen really that strong? Looking at Sir Ashen's confused eyes, our heroine assumed that he was now worried that she would refuse. At that moment, the guy asked the princess if she was still afraid to go outside. The girl took his hand and said that she was afraid, but if he was with her, then she thought that everything would be okay. At that very moment, while he was looking at the princess, he remembered Lowina's words. The girl told him that she hoped that he could find someone who would be dear to him. The guy laughed because in essence his world began to change, and this meant that the girl was right. Ashen held the girl's hand and hoped that he found it before it was too late, and yet the action is transferred some time forward when our heroine finally came to the Emperor. The man at that moment looked at the girl and assumed that the medicines he had sent to the Empress's palace had helped. Looking at the girl, he said that she looked absolutely healthy. Ashtart now wondered, what should she do? For 10 years, no one looked for our heroine. None of her family members came to visit her. Even the annual fireworks display that lights up the sky above the palace was never dedicated to her. He was at her sister's, whose birthday is on the same day as hers, and no one helped our heroine when all the maids left. Ashtart was a real forgotten princess. She was the star who was called the Star of Darkness of the Empire. No one heard her pray for her family to come. However, now the girl did not understand why everyone had suddenly become so persistent. It seemed like the girl had always wanted this, but at that very moment when she received it, the girl was not so happy. The man himself saw that the girl was reacting strangely to everything that surrounded her. He couldn't think of anything better to do than tell her that the food wasn't poisoned. Ashtart asked again in confusion. The Emperor laughed and said that for some reason she didn't want to eat. Ashtart asked in confusion if she could eat it, to which the Emperor asked if she really thought that food was just for looking at. The girl was surprised because there really were a lot of different things on the table. Looking at it now, she felt like she was in another world where she was out of place. And still, even despite all the beauty around her, the girl only became convinced that she was uncomfortable here. At this point, the Emperor broke the silence and decided to tell his daughter that she had gone to Rebecca. The man suddenly turned to the girl and asked if she knew what her mother had done to him. Our heroine did not understand what she could have done. He replied that even now, when he thinks about what she did, he is so angry that he has nightmares every day. And still, our heroine looked at him and asked in surprise what happened. The Emperor sighed heavily and replied that as soon as Rebecca became pregnant, she left him. The most surprising thing is that she didn't want to be near him, she only wanted the Imperial descendant. Looking at his daughter, the man asked in surprise if she thought so. Our heroine immediately realized that her father saw her mother in her, especially remembering the night when he mixed up their names. The girl at that moment suddenly said that he hated her mother very much and could not forgive her. That's why she decided to assume that because of her mother, he hated her too. The man certainly didn't understand this question, so he just asked in bewilderment what she was talking about. Our heroine in turn did not understand why he disliked her so much that he never came to visit her. The man wanted to say something in his defense, but at that moment they were interrupted by a guy who was looking for His Majesty. The man asked Dante what happened. The boy replied that the meeting of the Council of Nobles was to begin today. The Emperor, perplexed, asked if it was really today, to which Dante replied that now was not the best time for tea. Then the guy turned around because he wanted to say something to the princess where she should be now, but at that very moment he realized that Ashtart was sitting in front of him. The guy screamed in confusion and asked what she was doing there. The girl calmly greeted him. Dante, still in shock, asked when they had managed to become so close to drink tea together. One way or another, the Emperor apologized and said that it was time for him to go. Our heroine was not against it. In any case, she only thanked him for today's invitation. The man sighed heavily and said that he certainly enjoyed it. And yet, looking at the girl, he said that literally everything about her reminded him of Rebecca. Ashtart was having a hard time at that moment because suddenly being rejected by someone you loved was a terrible thing to even think about. She seemed to be able to partly understand why they did not come to visit her, but she was still very disappointed by this. The Emperor suddenly asked his daughter if she was upset with him. In turn, the girl asked herself this question: was she offended by him because of this? As impudent as it may sound, there was still resentment until recently. She knew she would be lying if she said she had never held a grudge. The Emperor himself understood everything. Only at this moment our heroine said that she no longer held a grudge against him. And even in these actions, the girl reminded him so much of Rebecca, who was just as kind. Holding back his pain, the Emperor asked her why she was not offended now. However, Dante was already sounding the alarm, saying that the meeting was about to begin, which meant they had to run. The Emperor really didn't want this, but it was necessary. The man went about his business, but at the end, he told Ashtart that they would see each other next time. The girl herself was thinking about the question at that moment, but Lowina's hand stopped her in time. The girl smiled and asked the princess if they would come back. Ashtart smiled and said that she was all for it, but she also found the answer to the question. She didn't resent them simply because she was able to find her real family. Meanwhile, the action moves to a meeting of the Imperial Council of Nobles. The Emperor sat at the head and spoke about the fact that they would have an honored guest at the upcoming religious service. The guys, perplexed, began to ask if they were really talking about Isaiah Sinciberia. Yes, the last remaining holy nation on the continent, Sinciberia. Only this man is allowed to be called His Eminence, the Pope's only legitimate child and his first successor. The country was already filled with rumors of his arrival. Someone suddenly asked, wasn't it obvious why he would come in person? The eldest nobleman, Marquis Kylo, said that he was sure that His Eminence wished to see the divine nature of Princess Amaryllis with his own eyes. In turn, the other guy said that Her Highness was still young, but since she was beautiful, he was sure that His Eminence was too. Anyway, at that moment, a guy approached the Emperor and said that if his lordship wanted to pay a visit, then they needed to decide about a guide to the guest of honor. This task was usually carried out by either Miragein or Noah, and there was never an exception, at least until now. The Emperor decided to inquire about this role, expecting to hear a banal answer. In response to this question, the man decided to suggest an option to ask Princess Amaryllis to be Lord Isaiah's guide. The man explained that the princess is the only star of Florence and he is sure that since Siberia will be happy. All the people started saying that they agreed it seemed like a good proposal and they didn't see any problems. The Marquis knew that if the princess were to act as His Eminence's guide, they could at least become closer. This would bring wealth and honor to the empire and would also strengthen their political position. However, the emperor said that it was incredibly strange. He wondered why they called Amaryllis the only star of the empire. What about Ashtart? The Marquis at this point began to apologize in surprise, saying that he had not thought the emperor asked everyone anyway. Did they really disagree with this? The younger noble Duke Arsan said that there is also a second child of the ruler that is correct. However, other people said that it was stupid because this child most likely didn't even know the basics. And yet the people at the table were perplexed that the emperor dared to pronounce the forbidden name which no one had pronounced for 10 years. The emperor went on to say that the other star in the prophecy that they all apparently really like is Ashtarte, and it does exist. The Marquis was surprised because once the emperor himself wanted most of all to forget her name, so why did he suddenly mention her? In any case, he apologized to the emperor, but for his part, he knew that he could not let his guard down. Emperor Orvan is the cruelest and at the same time the greatest emperor in history. As soon as he ascended the throne, he got rid of all the corrupt nobles. In those days, the palace was filled with cries and pleas for mercy, and if the emperor was not pleased with a man or he did not bring help, he would behead him without hesitation. That is why the Marquis understood that he should not step on the emperor's heels. But the issue regarding the conductor remained relevant, so it needed to be resolved. Orvan suddenly said that they could do as Marquis Carlos wished, if Princess Amaryllis agreed, of course. The Marquis began to thank the emperor, saying that he was very grateful, but in fact he could not understand what he was thinking. Soon the action takes us to the room of the two princes. Noah told his brother that he had already heard that he and Riley would have work at the sacred festival. Miragein said he knew all that. But what's more, it was already the 5th sugar cube Noah had thrown. The guy, perplexed, replied that it was still not enough. The guy sighed heavily in bewilderment and asked his brother to make him 6-pack abs next time. Anyway, Noah asked his brother if he had heard that Ashtart had been to tea with the emperor. The boy replied that he had never been late before. But because of the meeting with her, His Majesty was late for the meeting of the Council of Nobles. And how could he not know this? In recent days, their father had been acting quite strangely, suddenly becoming interested in Ashtarte. At that moment, the boy remembered his father's words about the eyes of Princess Ashtarte. He remembered with great difficulty that Empress Rebecca also had golden eyes. Was he really interested in the princess only because she looked like the empress? And still he could not tell what His Majesty was thinking, even when he asked him about the visit to the empress's palace. Noah suddenly said that he had asked him too. Miragein looked at his brother in bewilderment and asked him what he had told his father to which the boy replied that he had not told him anything. The guy seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, and Noah asked if he really had to say something. Miragein replied that everything was fine. Anyway, the boy looked at his brother and thanked him, but the prince only said that there was no reason to thank him because he acted of his own free will. Miragein at this point decided to inquire a little. He assumed that his brother was also interested in Ashtarte. After thinking for a moment, Noah said that he was interested in her in his own way. The boy laughed, saying that she had attracted the attention of many. Then, looking at the head maid, Miragein asked if she agreed. Yes, this is the same senior maid who works for the high priest, and her name is Medina Inklin. One way or another, the prince looked at the girl in surprise and asked her to raise her head higher. He asked if he was correct in his understanding that she was in charge of supply chain and product management and budget allocation. The woman replied that he was correct. At that moment, the guy put the documents on the table and said that the budget statement of the Empress's palace had fallen into his hands. After pointing out some points, he said that there were some things that raised very big questions for him. Like a predator, Miragein looked at the maid and asked her to answer her questions, because if she was innocent, then it would not be difficult to answer. The woman was incredibly nervous, but in the meantime, the first question followed. The guy asked if everything written in this statement was true. Medina was horrified because she remembered that the priest had promised to deal with this, and what should she do now? Silence fell over the room. The prince continued to ask the girl in surprise why she was silent. Based on the maid's reaction, he assumed there was a reason why she was having difficulty answering. slammed the table, and asked whether what he saw on the budget statement was true or not. The girl clearly remembered Horium saying that there was evidence left in the budget statement, and he said that he would deal with it. Medena was incredibly angry, but she was sure that the high priest would not abandon her just because they were both involved in this. Only because of this, she decided that she should not be afraid. At this moment, the girl turned to His Highness. The girl introduced herself, saying that she had lived her whole life for the palace and Florence. The prince assumed that she was going to beg him. However, the girl began to cry and say that she did not know what was wrong. And anyway, she said that everything on the budget statement was correct, so she didn't understand what happened. At that moment, the prince hit the table with all his might and asked, "Is everything really true here?" The girl continued to answer briefly and clearly, saying that she swears on her honor. Medena assured the princes that she had done nothing wrong, but only the maid knew one detail. If her lie is exposed, they will not limit themselves to simply banishing her from the palace. They will lock her in the dungeon for the rest of her days. And yet the girl continued to stand her ground because she knew that she simply could not retreat. In any case, her fate was in the hands of the high priest. However, at that very moment, her words of joy were heard. The prince assumed that it seemed to be true. He said that her work was too perfect that he did not believe it at first, but decided that he should praise her diligent and long service. He asked her not to worry. Medena told him that she would not dare, and to hear such words from the prince was a real honor for her. Only Miragein continued to say that if the head maid was so hard-working, she should know that disrespecting the Imperial family would at best cost her hanging. The girl at that moment turned pale and was whiter than anything white. She did not understand what the prince meant now. However, Miragein told her that she could go. The girl bowed and asked for forgiveness. At this moment, the girl was about to leave the room, but a loud noise was heard behind her. Turning her head, she noticed Noah, who apologized to his brother, saying that the teacups were too fragile lately. The boy asked in confusion if his brother's hand was okay, to which the prince replied that everything was fine. However, at this time, Medena was horrified because she realized for sure that Prince Noah had broken this cup on purpose. And yet, after a few moments, the girl left the office and the feelings mixed together. Somehow, she managed to understand something for sure. She was absolutely sure that Princes Noah and Miragein wanted to tell her not to do stupid things. The girl didn't really want to compare, but she still understood that next time it could be her in place of the cup. She instantly began to move away from this place. Meanwhile, Miragein was very disappointed because everything was as Medena said. In the budget statement, everything was correct. If we speak correctly, then everything was too perfect. He was absolutely sure that someone had deliberately fixed everything. The action at this time shifts to the knights, who were surprised to tell the captain that this was wrong. The boys were puzzled and asked if he was just going to leave. They all hoped that it wasn't true. However, Ashen declared that Vice Captain Alec would be their leader. The guy began to stutter in bewilderment. The guy was in shock and didn't even know how to describe his emotions, because even though he was the captain, and still he asked not to leave, and if he leaves, he must tell why. They assumed that he would marry a beautiful girl. At the very least, they asked him to reconsider his decision regarding Alec, but Ashen replied that he had served under him for a long time, which meant that they were all true knights. Ashen looked at them and said that knighthood would not fall just because he was not with them, so he asked everyone to take care of themselves and not forget about hard work. Looking at Lucas, the guy also added that he was now the vice captain. The guy, confused, began to ask what he was going to do if he was leaving them. The guy smiled and said that there was one aristocrat he would like to protect. After some time, he came to the prince's office with a letter. Miragein looked at the envelope in surprise and asked what it was. Ashen replied in a calm voice that it was his resignation letter, and he asked for it to be accepted. Miragein jumped up at this point in bewilderment and asked what the reason was. Why did he decide to leave the Imperial knighthood? The guy told him that there was something he wanted to do before it was too late. The prince was surprised that everything was so important that he was ready to quit. But what is this? At this point, Ashen responded that he would like to be Princess Ashtart's protector. Miragein was in incredible shock because the reason why the stately knight wanted to become a pathetic guard was Ashtart. The prince told him that he should know that the princess could not have her own knight without the emperor's decision. He would become a simple guard, which meant he would lose all the power he had. Miragein continued to explain, saying that everything he took for granted would just disappear, and wouldn't he regret it? In response to all these words, Sir Ashen simply smiled and said that he knew about all this. Instead of this meaningless power, he chose to protect the person who means a lot to him. That's why the guy was confident that he was ready to do literally anything. Taking the envelope in his hands, the prince said that he understood and still accepted this resignation with respect for his decision. Ashen thanked His Highness. One way or another, the prince also noticed that Ashen already had his things, which meant that he was already getting ready to leave the palace immediately. The guy didn't understand what they were talking about now because he had literally already submitted his resignation. Miragein smiled and only said that he was serious as always. One way or another, the transfer to the Empress's palace would take him time, but for now, holding out 2 sheets of paper, he asked to find these people. As he began to study the sheet in more detail, Ashen was only a little surprised because he had seen or heard about these people before. For example, a daughter from a family that was going through a financial crisis, twins with scars on their faces, and a person whose last name is unknown. Sir Ashen raised his head and asked the prince in surprise who they were. The boy replied that these were potential candidates for service in the Empress's palace. The boy asked in confusion what the candidates for the position of servants of the princess meant. Becoming a servant in the Imperial palace is as honorable as being a knight because it is not something that just anyone can do. Only ladies from noble houses are eligible for this position, and the palace does not choose anyone with financial problems or visible scars. And yet the boy assumed that these people must be the only ones who are acceptable since everyone in the Empire is afraid of the Princess of Darkness. Ashen hoped that at least one of these people would be able to serve Princess Ashtart honestly. The prince at this point ordered the captain to let the people decide for themselves, and if they agreed, then he had to enter the Empress's palace with them. Ashen was definitely surprised because he clearly noticed that at some point the crown prince wanted to help Princess Ashtart. Those who meet the princess are undoubtedly changed. One way or another, the boy bowed and said that he would accept this final order. Already heading towards the door, Sir Ashen himself understood that he was certainly no exception. The action shifts to half a month later. At this time, our heroine decided to clean up the street a little, so she picked up a broom and started sweeping. The girl was just finishing cleaning, and soon she was just proudly looking at all this cleanliness. However, a puzzled maid appeared behind Ashtart, asking if the girl had really returned to her old ways. Lowina knew that the girl was cleaning behind her back, but our heroine answered her that she knew that the maid asked her not to do it, but Lowina looked very tired, so the girl decided to help her. However, the girl also decided to please the princess by making sweet milk for her. The girl held out the cup and thanked Her Highness for the help she had not dared to ask for. Our heroine was drinking milk at that moment and said that she was doing as she promised. She was keeping this secret, but she would also get sweet milk more often. By the way, after drinking tea with the Emperor, invitations and medicines stopped coming from the Imperial palace. And what's even more surprising is that the girl noticed that even the princes stopped visiting her, and in fact our heroine was only glad about this because finally it became calm. But the next day something happened that the girl certainly could not have expected. Ashen stood at the threshold of the palace and he was not alone today. The guy greeted them and said what kind of people they were. In short, he introduced them as new servants appointed to the Empress's palace. All these people bowed down and told the princess that it was an honor for them to serve her. Lowina was skeptical, so she asked Sir Ashen if they were really all the princess's servants. After all, these people wouldn't have been sent here if no one knew who they were. The girl asked who had authorized this. Ashen replied that it was all the prince's doing. As soon as Lowina heard these words, she didn't even want to hear about it. The girl started complaining about him, but the guy told her that it was not what she thought. Lowina pressed her lip and said that there was a limit to how much he could insult the princess. At that moment, all the guests who had come to the princess's door lowered their heads, realizing that they would most likely go back. Nevertheless, our heroine joyfully began to greet them and say that her name was Ashtart. Lowina was shocked that the princess had destroyed her entire plan, but the girl began to communicate with everyone who was unfamiliar to her. Anyway, everything seemed fine, and what's more, all these girls applied voluntarily. Lowina, of course, was shocked by what she heard, and Ashen at that moment asked her if she could accept them now. The girl said she didn't like it, but she couldn't continue to take care of the princess alone. Anyway, there was something else that interested her. Looking at Ashen, the girl asked in confusion why he was dressed like that. Just at that very moment, the boy knelt down and turned to the princess, saying that he would like to inform her that from this day on he would be her personal guard. Both Ashtart and Lowina were shocked by what had just happened before their eyes. After some time, the girl asked him what about knighthood, to which the guy replied that everything would be fine with them without him, so there was no need to worry. The boy looked at the princess and said that he wanted to serve her, and it was his own decision, so he asked her not to blame himself. However, Ashtart didn't know for sure if it was okay to just give up the position of knight captain because of her. The girl began to ask herself questions. Would he be offended? And if he couldn't come back even if he wanted to, would she be able to look him in the eye? Only at that moment the guy turned to the princess and asked for forgiveness for his impudence, but still his choice was the best decision in his life. He was glad that he would be the guard who would protect her from all dangers. That is why he assured the girl that he would never regret deciding to serve her. Never. At this time, Lowina thought that she could trust Sir Ashen, but she didn't know for sure about the servants. In any case, the girl decided that she could send them back if they did not do their job well. At this point, the princess bowed down and said that from now on she would be under his care, and now she asked if she could be free. The guy smiled and said that she shouldn't worry. The girl immediately stood up and headed towards the others. However, at that moment, Ashen seemed to read the maid's thoughts and asked to give those girls a chance. In any case, she could have stayed on the princess's side of her own free will. The girl sighed heavily and said that it was so, but she was still asked about it. The action moves forward a few days. An argument broke out on the street in which the girl, perplexed, said that all this was her work. The new maid at the Empress's palace, Olga, said that she would not dare let the princess's hands get wet. Our heroine, perplexed, said that in that case she could simply help collect water. She couldn't help at all. Nevertheless, the maid thanked her but said that there was nothing she needed to do. Our heroine sighed heavily at that moment because this maid was just like Lowina, who fought for her job. By the way, she was the best worker with the softest hands, a thoughtful and calm person with light purple hair. Ashtart understood that she was involuntarily drawn to people with purple features in their appearance, so she would like to get closer to her. After some time, our heroine went back into the palace and immediately smelled a very delicious aroma. She couldn't confuse this smell with anything because it was mashed potatoes. The girl immediately realized that this smell was coming from the kitchen. There were 2 girls in the kitchen. They knew it was almost lunchtime, so they wanted to hurry. One of them asked to put the food on the plates and she would set them out. They were twins, the youngest of the new servants. The one on the left was called Moana Gerald, and the one on the right was Morgan. Our heroine looked at their faces and asked herself one question that interested her. Where did these scars on their faces come from? Either way, she knew she shouldn't really care about things like that. Ashtart was first and foremost excited about the opportunity to make new friends almost her age. Our heroine decided that she wanted to surprise them, and she and Lowina sometimes played pranks on each other. At this point, Moana turned to Morgan and said that she forgot to ask before did she put the medicine on her scar. The girl immediately laughed and asked her sister not to be silly because it had been obvious for a long time. Morgan asked her sister if she still thought that everything would heal if she used the medicine. Moana told her sister that she couldn't know for sure and she wanted to know why the girl was so pessimistic. The doctor told them that it was good medicine. However, Morgan replied that this miracle cost only 30 copper coins, not even 1 silver coin. She thought it was strange because quality medicine would be expensive. However, at that moment, Moana started talking about how there was going to be a holy festival. Soon Morgan asked what that had to do with them. The girl immediately said that the priests of Siberia would come, and that meant there was hope. She proudly declared that perhaps a doctor using holy magic could help them. Ashtart realized from this conversation that the sisters were trying to heal their scars with holy magic. Morgan asked her sister in bewilderment if she had forgotten that even their parents couldn't accept them. They said they would rather they died. The girl asked them to think better about why they came to the Empress's palace and finally wake up from their dreams. Morgan sighed heavily and said that this was their reality, and for better or worse, they had to accept it. Our heroine had no idea they were in this situation, but she shouldn't have been eavesdropping. Ashtart decided she needed to leave before she was noticed. Soon our heroine approached the last place where there should have been another girl. Ashtart was afraid of being interrupted because she was patiently waiting for the right moment. She heard that the last maid is a pharmacist named Veronica. Since her arrival, she has been sitting in the medicine storage room, and by the way, Sir Ashen told her to go to Veronica if she got sick. Ashtart wondered if she would be bothering the girl if she just came. And yet the girl decided to go full speed ahead, thinking that she would just quickly greet her and return, but at that moment, Sir Ashen stood before her. Moreover, he was wounded. The girl asked what had happened. The guy smiled and said that everything was fine because it was just a small scratch. Ashtart was telling him to hurry up and stop the bleeding anyway. After all, they had a bunch of drugs for this which His Majesty sent. In fact, the door opened in this way. Inside the building, there was a pharmacist and the new maid Veronica, who was busy with something at that moment. The girl immediately noticed that she had guests, and also that one of the guests needed help. Taking the medicine, the girl said it would burn a little, but Ashen said it was okay. In that case, you had to endure it for literally a second. Shortly after these words, Veronica turned the bottle of potion over and poured it onto Sir Ashen's wound. In just a moment, the wound closed and all the blood disappeared. It was amazing. Ashtart was amazed that Veronica could make such effective medicines. Sir Ashen at this point asked the pharmacist in surprise if she had really used holy water, to which the girl replied that this medicine was similar to it, but they were different. She explained that it was araberk, a medicinal herb used to relieve pain and stop bleeding. Holding out her hand with the medicine, the girl asked if he needed more, to which Ashen replied that this was more than enough for him. Our heroine really liked the medicine that heals wounds, and she immediately came up with a plan. The girl approached the pharmacist and asked if she could borrow this potion for her. Within moments, our heroine was running back to the palace hoping that it would help them. At this moment, Veronica was watching the princess and said that she was very different from the rumors, because people say that she is an evil person. Rumors spread even to the outlying regions like Aelion, where she came from. She heard that Princess Amaryllis met her, and suddenly the darkness began to swallow the light. All she heard were only negative rumors, so she was scared that when she got the chance to become a maid. And yet the girl decided that rumors should never be trusted. To say that someone whose hands were rough from working at such a young age was evil was simply not an option. At that moment, Veronica thought, because she wondered if the princess wanted to heal her wounds covered with scars or what. Suddenly the girl asked Ashen where he got so hurt. She was surprised that the Empress's palace was such a dangerous place, to which the guy sheepishly began to say that it was an accident and nothing more. The guy said he could have tried harder, but he managed to get a mistake. The girl still didn't understand what was going on. The action takes us back a bit. Lowina was confused and asked Sir Ashen what he was doing. She screamed in confusion and asked why he was playing with the sword like that, to which the guy proudly replied that it was acrobatic practice. He thought that the princess might like it. Actually, there is no need to think about how he got hurt because the trick did not go according to plan. In any case, we are again transported to the kitchen. Our heroine at this moment found only Moana, who was afraid of the Princess of Darkness, but the girl asked where Morgan was now. The girl, horrified, began to ask why she was looking for her, and immediately began to apologize for her sister. Ashtart was shocked, but immediately said that she was not angry. The girl explained that she came because she had a gift for them. Now, at this moment, Moana was very surprised. Our heroine handed over the ointment, saying that it heals scars very well. The girl smiled and said that Veronica told her that she needed to apply it regularly for a week. Moana did not believe that the princess took this expensive medicine for simple servants. Anyway, stuttering, the girl thanked Her Highness. The girl pressed the bottle and said that they would be happy to use it. However, at that moment Morgan came up and snatched the medicine and said that it was not necessary. The girl asked for forgiveness but asked Her Highness to take the ointment because they did not need it. Moana asked why she was acting like that, but her sister asked her to be quiet. Then she asked Ashtart if she understood correctly that it was Veronica's ointment. The girl said that there was no reason for them to take this ointment because it did not work on old scars. They had already tried this ointment when they first met Veronica. That is why the girl insisted and claimed that their scars would never heal. That is why she asked not to give false hope that they would be able to heal these scars. Our heroine was surprised by her look because it was different from her sister's. Moana showed that she wanted to try something else. Only the girl understood that Morgan had already given in. The girl asked the princess for forgiveness one way or another if she had crossed the line, but asked to be allowed to take her leave. The action moves to 2 days later. Our heroine came to Veronica again, and this time she wanted to find an ointment that could heal old scars. She immediately realized that this medicine was not for her. One way or another, the girl began to nod her head, and Veronica suddenly asked if these ointments were by any chance for Morgan and Moana. The girl answered the princess that unfortunately medicine cannot fix everything. Our heroine was very disappointed. The pharmacist suddenly said that it would be difficult to do anything without using magic, and then the girl's eyes regained hope. She looked at Veronica and asked what kind of magic was needed. The girl asked again in surprise. Our heroine repeated that she had just said that the twins could be cured with magic, so what kind of magic could have cured these scars? The girl laughed at that moment and said that she was an ordinary doctor, so she couldn't know about something like that. Though if she thought about it, she heard that the crown prince had deciphered a holy spell, and she heard that it was some kind of miraculous healing magic. One way or another, she was sure that only the prince was capable of using this, and in general, she did not know why she was telling this. And her question was relevant because at that time the princess was no longer around. Ashtart at this moment received hope again because she understood that the crown prince Miragein had deciphered the holy spell. Only His Highness knew this spell, but there are no spells that she could not cast. Soon she began to read his notes. Deciphered magic failed spells, spells that had not yet been deciphered. After just a few moments, our heroine was incredibly happy because she was able to find what she was looking for. Holy magic successfully deciphered. It was a high-level holy magic that restored lost body parts. Ashtart definitely decided that this should heal the old scars. Then Moana and Morgan will no longer have to hide. But now the problem was different. She had promised Lowina to keep her magic a secret. Moreover, she remembered how she had sworn on her little fingers, and that could not be broken. However, she wanted to help her friends too much, so she asked the maid for forgiveness in advance. The action shifts to a few days later. Princess Amaryllis, as decided, was the person who greeted the guests. And by the way, the Lord was supposed to arrive soon, so why did it have to rain like that? The maid assumed that the heavens were displeased. The girl said that according to rumors, Lord Isaiah is very handsome and she is also the light of Firenze. Surely the heavens will be jealous when such a perfect couple appears together. Amaryllis was very pleased with such good flattery. The girl at this point said that she was initially irritated that she would have to be a guide for someone she didn't know, but everyone praised how handsome he was. But it couldn't be otherwise because isn't this the least requirement for her future groom? The girl nodded her head, thinking that she would first show him the lily garden, which does not fade even with the changing of the seasons. At this time, the royal convoy arrived at the palace, walking right through the pouring rain. Soon after, a few moments later, the supposed heir to the high priest, Isaiah Siberia, emerged from the carriage, asking if this was really the Florence palace. At that moment, the boy felt a strange aura. The assistant approached him and asked if everything was okay, to which he replied that he was simply tired from the long carriage ride. But in reality, he couldn't understand what this feeling was because he felt something ominous somewhere nearby. The action shifts to the very beginning of the holy festival. Princess Amaryllis was showing Lord Isaiah the garden of lilies that His Majesty had given her. Isaiah asked in surprise if it was really lily season, to which the girl replied that she had asked her brother to make the garden bloom all year round. The sight and scent of lilies delighted the princess every day, so she adored this garden. At that moment, the girl realized that the more she looked at Isaiah, the more handsome he seemed to her. The headmaid said that boys become more masculine with age. Just thinking about Isaiah reaching this point made her almost faint. Golden locks that shine like the bright sun and those eyes like sparkling sapphires. If such a beautiful face is not her destiny, then who would be suitable for this role? However, at this point, Isaiah said that he was very grateful that she had invited him to such a beautiful place, but he was tired after a long journey. He apologized and said that if she didn't mind, she could walk him to his quarters. The girl was shocked by what she heard, and moreover, she definitely felt something. Although he was smiling, she definitely felt cold from him. Amaryllis at this point apologized and said that she had not had guests for a long time, so she got a little carried away and was unable to show sensitivity. The guy at that moment said that everything was quite the opposite. He was embarrassed that he was not able to properly take care of his condition. The girl smiled and said that she would immediately take him to the chambers and he needed to follow her. Soon people approached His Holiness and asked if everything was okay. The boy replied that he had a bad feeling. His assistant immediately began to assume that it was all because of the lily garden. Was it really worth cleaning it out? However, he said that he did not talk about the garden, and although it bothered him to go against nature for the sake of his desires, and he is proud of it because the flowers lose their naturalness and beauty, somehow Isaiah wondered if she was the light of Firenze. He could not understand the meaning of the words of the Lord from the prophecy that the high priest received. In any case, the action is transferred to the same evening. The guy was lying in his chambers and understood that sleep did not want to visit him at all. With each passing moment, he realized that he could no longer stay here, so he decided to go out for a walk. On his way out, his people met him and asked His Holiness where he was going at such a late hour. The guy replied that he wanted to take a walk and that he didn't need to follow him. As soon as Isaiah left, the guys began to discuss among themselves in bewilderment what was going on with him all day, and at this time the guy came out of his chambers and saw in front of him a palace which most likely belonged to Princess Amaryllis. The guy looked towards this palace and assumed that he should not go there. Ever since Princess Amaryllis became famous as a star of light, he had been looking forward to meeting her, and in appearance, she really does look like the goddess of light from the legends. But after meeting the princess, he felt like she was something that shouldn't exist at all. Anyway, while Isaiah was exploring the area, he climbed into the same place where Noah liked to sit. To his surprise, the guy saw another palace in front of him, although no one had told him about it. At the same time, our heroine was walking down the corridor, and for some reason unknown to her, her stomach hurt. There was still an assumption, though, perhaps she had indigestion after dinner, or it could have been because she was thinking too much. Our heroine literally couldn't even eat in peace because of her worries. The girl knew that she could heal their scars, but she couldn't break her promise, so she talked herself out of it. In any case, she needed to find Veronica's room because she should have some medicine for indigestion. Nevertheless, our heroine was like a magnet for other people's conversations, and the kitchen once again became an active discussion area. Our heroine heard the words about scars and immediately realized that they were twins when suddenly Moana's scream was heard from there saying that her sister was stupid. The girl asked her sister why she was taking away her hope. Why couldn't she hope that all the scars would heal? Morgan still asked to stop it, but Moana said that she couldn't accept it as easily as she did. The girl cried, saying that if she didn't care, then she was in despair. Ashtart overheard their conversation and was shocked that the girls were rejected by their own family because of their scars. However, at that moment, Morgan's voice was heard screaming, saying that she also wanted those scars to disappear. The girl wanted a normal life like everyone else. She wanted her sister to get better, but the more she tried and wished, the more she realized that this would never happen. Morgan cried, saying that all these empty hopes only made things more difficult for them. Our heroine was shocked because for the first time she noticed Morgan crying, although she could not even imagine that she could do that. After all, she was always a girl without fear and showed her scars without even trying to hide them. But nevertheless, the girl said that she wanted these scars to disappear, and even better if she herself disappeared. Just at that moment, the door to their room opened. The girls looked at the princess in bewilderment. In turn, our heroine told them that she could rid them both of their scars.